evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we are checking ourselves into one of the strangest institutions America ever built to make people feel better, the mid-century hospital. Picture a building that runs on starch, silence, and unwavering confidence, where the floors are polished to a mirror shine, and the treatments underneath that shine would send a modern physician sprinting for the nearest exit. Before we step through the doors, a sincere thank you to everyone who requested this topic. This channel exists because of you, and I read every comment, even the ones written at 3 a.m., which, judging by the timestamps, is apparently when most of you do your best thinking. If you're enjoying these long, slow descents into the past, consider subscribing. Drop a comment telling me your city and your local time. And if you'd rather listen without a single ad breaking the mood, the podcast feed is linked below, along with a membership that unlocks extended, ad-free cuts of every episode. Now turn down the lights. Let a fan hum somewhere in the background. Sink into your pillow. And let's wonder together for a moment. Have you ever been told that the cure for nearly anything, a broken bone, a broken heart, a broken mood, is simply to lie down and not move for a very long time? Have you ever wondered what it was like to be handed a cigarette by the very doctor who is supposed to be protecting your lungs? Could you make it through a week of injections from a needle that has already made the rounds of half the ward before it reaches you? Would you survive 7 days of colorless soup, rigid visiting hours, and a physician who has quietly decided that you are better off not knowing what is actually wrong with you? And what happens when this week's miracle treatment turns out to involve a machine that hums, glows faintly, and is, by the way, radioactive? You are about to find out, because congratulations. You have just opened your eyes in a hospital bed somewhere in the United States in the year 1955. Your gown doesn't quite close in the back. Your chart, hanging just out of reach, carries a note you cannot read. And somewhere down the corridor, an orderly is wheeling in a large piece of equipment that whirs in a way that inspires absolutely no confidence at all. So let's begin at the beginning, the front desk. Because getting into a 1950s hospital is a bit like checking into an extremely humorless hotel that also happens to legally own your body for the next several days. Walking through the door, you arrive clutching your side with one hand and what remains of your dignity with the other. A woman behind the counter, cap starched into a shape that could probably deflect a bullet, looks you over, sizes up your situation in under 5 seconds, and slides a clipboard across the counter, thick enough to double as a doorstop. There is no soft opening question about how you're feeling. There is no scale of 1 to 10. There is only a form, a pen that skips every third letter, and the quiet, unspoken understanding that from this moment forward, you will be discussed constantly and consulted rarely. You settle into a chair that seems engineered specifically to discourage comfort and begin filling in blanks. Name, age, occupation, religious affiliation, next of kin. A surprising number of questions about relatives you haven't thought about since a wedding several years back. The pen catches. The chair creaks. Somewhere behind a pane of frosted glass, a telephone rings unanswered, because everyone in this building appears to be permanently, gloriously busy. This is not simple paperwork. This is the beginning of your entire medical identity, condensed onto a few sheets of onion skin paper. From here forward, that folder will, in the eyes of the institution, matter rather more than you do. Then comes something resembling an interview, though the word is generous. A clerk reads your answers back to you in a monotone, correcting your spelling as she goes and raising an eyebrow at your penmanship. Your symptoms are translated into a private shorthand you were never taught. Your fear, and there is plenty of it, goes entirely unrecorded, because fear doesn't fit neatly into any box on the form. You attempt to explain, in your own words, exactly what brought you here today, and you're met with a polite nod, and the gentle reminder that the doctor, and only the doctor, will determine what is actually the matter with you. Your own read on your own body has just been quietly filed under not currently relevant. If fortune smiles, a porter appears with a wheelchair, and you're rolled down a hallway thick with the smell of floor wax and boiled cotton. If you're not so lucky, you walk, gripping your paperwork like a passport to a country whose customs you don't yet understand. Doors swing open ahead of you and shut behind you. A cart rattles past loaded with something metal and covered. A nurse calls out a name that isn't yours, and 3 separate patients flinch in 3 separate beds. At last, you reach the ward desk, staffed by an even more senior woman in an even more severe cap, who inspects your paperwork, inspects you, and pronounces you, more or less, fit to lie down. A paper bracelet is fastened to your wrist, your name inked onto it with careful precision. And with that small motion, the transformation is complete. You have gone from person to patient, which in 1955 is a distinctly different, distinctly more powerless category of human being. You no longer choose when you eat, when you sleep, or when you're allowed to stand. All of that independence has been traded for a bed, 3 meals, and a promise of care whose fine print nobody bothered to read aloud. So take one last breath as a free citizen, because your autonomy has just been checked at the door, right alongside your street clothes. Let's go take a look at exactly where you'll be spending the next several nights. The open ward. Forget the private room. Forget the door that closes and the little television bolted to the wall. You are being wheeled into a long, echoing hall, the open ward, lined on both sides with identical iron-framed beds, each one currently occupied by a stranger in some fascinating stage of misfortune. To your left, a man is coughing with what feels like genuine theatrical commitment. To your right, someone is crying quietly into government tissue linen. There are no real curtains here, only a thin, folding screen that gets wheeled over whenever something especially private is about to happen, which somehow only makes the moment feel more exposed, not less. The room stretches on and on. 20 beds, maybe 30, all matching, all filled, all facing one another across a wide strip of gleaming floor. High windows let in plenty of daylight and absolutely zero privacy. Every sound in this room travels, every cough, every murmured prayer, every complaint about the food bounces off hard tile and lands directly in your ear, whether you asked for it or not. Within a day, you will know more about the private business of total strangers than you know about some members of your own family. Your assigned bed arrives with all the finality of a court verdict. It's narrow, elevated, and made up with sheets tucked so severely that climbing beneath them feels like breaking into a sealed envelope. You wriggle in and understand, almost immediately, that you have just joined a small, involuntary community, one you didn't apply for and cannot easily leave. An older gentleman across the aisle raises a hand in greeting. 2 beds down, someone is already asking when supper arrives. You are now a citizen of a strange miniature village where everyone is unwell, and nobody is going home anytime soon. Personal space, that quiet modern luxury, becomes a distant memory almost instantly. You will overhear your neighbors receive difficult news. They will overhear yours. When the man beside you is examined, you will learn the complete geography of his ailment in exhaustive detail. Delivered at a volume the doctor sees no particular reason to lower. And when your turn comes, the entire ward will lean in, not out of cruelty, but simply out of the boredom of people who currently have nowhere else to direct their attention. Privacy, in this room, is a rumor everyone has heard about, but nobody has actually witnessed. There are admittedly small comforts. A kind word from the next bed can carry you through a long, empty afternoon. The veterans of the ward, the ones who have been here for weeks already, will teach you its unspoken rhythms. Which nurse is the gentlest when the tea actually arrives? How to catch 15 minutes of real sleep between interruptions. A strange kind of camaraderie takes root among people thrown together by bad luck and boiled linens. You share the same ceiling, the same clock, and the same collective groan whenever the dinner cart reveals its contents. Misery, it turns out, is marginally easier to bear when it's shared out loud. But make no mistake, this room offers no real rest. It is a stage, and every patient in it performs their recovery in front of a captive audience, day and night, under the same flat, fluorescent light. You will come to know everyone's coughs, everyone's snoring patterns, and everyone's strong opinions about the soup, whether you wanted to or not. Sleep, when it comes, arrives in small, stolen fragments, chased off by footsteps and the distant clatter of a trolley somewhere down the hall. So get comfortable in that narrow iron bed, because here is the wildest part of all. You may not be allowed out of it for a very long time. The gospel of bed rest. Now here comes the detail that will make your modern brain physically recoil. In this hospital, doing absolutely nothing is not a suggestion. It is the treatment. It is the philosophy. It is very nearly a religion practiced with the devotion of true believers, And every single member of staff in this building is a faithful congregant. Broke your ankle, bed rest, just had a baby, 2 weeks flat on your back minimum, feeling a little low, a little tired, a little unlike yourself. Into the bed you go, recovering from an operation. Do not even consider wiggling a toe until a man in a white coat personally grants you written permission to do so. The physicians of this era treat physical movement roughly the way a house cat treats bathwater, with deep suspicion and total avoidance whenever humanly possible. And so you will lie there, hour after hour, staring at a ceiling that offers absolutely nothing in the way of entertainment, growing measurably weaker by the day, while every single person who checks on you offers warm congratulations on how beautifully you are resting. The logic on its face seems almost reasonable. Your body is unwell, the thinking goes. So surely the kindest possible gift you can give it is complete and total rest. No effort spared, no energy wasted, every last calorie funneled directly into the business of healing. And so you are instructed to be still, gloriously, thoroughly, almost heroically still. Walking to the bathroom is, in many cases, simply not permitted, replaced instead by a bedpan and a very particular, very specific flavor of humiliation. You are propped up, arranged just so, tucked in tight, and then told to do precisely nothing, with all the solemn dedication of a professional at the top of their field. Doing nothing, as it turns out, is exhausting in its own peculiar way. By day 2, the ceiling has become the entirety of your known universe. You have counted every crack running through the plaster. You have named the water stain in the corner. You've decided it looks vaguely like a rabbit, though you're prepared to be argued out of this. You have developed genuine, deeply held opinions about the light fixture directly above your head. Time itself seems to stretch and warp in strange ways. An hour crawls by like an entire wasted afternoon. The clock at the far end of the ward appears to tick more slowly purely out of spite, as if it, too, has been instructed to conserve its energy. You would trade a full week of your remaining life for the simple privilege of a brisk walk around the block. And yet, a brisk walk around the block is precisely, exactly, the one thing currently denied to you. Your legs twitch with stored up, unspent energy, while the rest of your body slowly begins turning, quite literally, to mush. And here is the quiet, cruel irony that nobody standing in this room has fully worked out just yet. All of this heroic, celebrated stillness is not nearly as helpful as everybody assumes. Muscles left unused for days on end begin to waste away. Joints left unbent begin to stiffen. Blood, which rather prefers to keep circulating, grows slow and sluggish and prone to forming dangerous clots. Lungs held too still for too long can begin to gather fluid in their lower reaches. The human body, after all, was built to move, and asking it to lie perfectly flat for week after week is a bit like parking a car in a garage for 12 months, and then acting shocked when the engine refuses to turn over. The very rest that was meant to cure you is, in a slow an invisible way, quietly making you weaker. But try explaining that to anyone on this ward. Bed rest is gospel here, and questioning gospel is simply not within a patient's job description. When the physician makes his morning rounds and finds you lying obediently flat on your back, he nods with an expression of genuine, deep approval, as though you have personally achieved something remarkable simply by remaining horizontal for 12 consecutive hours. The nurses praise your stillness in passing. Your chart records in careful handwriting your excellent and total compliance. By every measure this era respects, you are, for now, the ideal patient, which is to say, you haven't moved a meaningful muscle in 3 full days, and everyone in the building considers this a tremendous success. So you sink back into the pillow and give yourself over entirely to the tyranny of rest. You will lie here through breakfast, through the long, empty, featureless middle of the day, through the slow crawl of evening, marinating quietly in your own stillness, like a very patient roast left in a very slow oven. Somewhere out in the future, decades from now, medicine will eventually discover that getting patients up and moving, often within a single day of surgery, actually speeds recovery enormously, and hospitals everywhere will begin hustling people gently onto their feet the very next morning. But that particular revelation has not yet arrived at this address. And so, for the time being, your only job is to lie here quietly and think about absolutely nothing at all. Now, since you will be spending an almost unreasonable amount of time in that particular bed, it seems only fair that we take a proper look at exactly what you'll be wearing while you do it. The gown. Let's address the hospital gown directly, because frankly, it is a small, quiet crime against the human body. This is a thin sheet of cotton fabric held together loosely by a scattering of fabric ties, an item that appears to have been designed by someone who had heard second-hand rumors about the concept of clothing, but had never personally examined a finished garment. It ties in the back, or more accurately, it makes a token gesture toward tying in the back, leaving you exposed to every draft in the building, every passing visitor, and the last remaining scraps of your own self-respect. There is no cozy robe layered over the top. There is no clever second gown worn backwards as an improvised cape, because no enterprising patient has yet stumbled upon that particular trick and passed it down through the generations. Consider, for a moment, the actual construction of the thing, if design is even the correct word for it. The fabric has been boiled and reboiled so many hundreds of times that it has gone soft, thin, and faintly gray, worn down to the point where you could reasonably read a newspaper through it if you held it up to the light. It is cut generously in every single place where generosity is entirely unnecessary, and stingily in the one specific place where a little extra fabric would genuinely matter. The ties themselves, and there are never quite enough of them, are positioned in such a way that no human arm, regardless of flexibility, can reach all of them simultaneously. You manage to secure the top tie, twist awkwardly to reach the bottom one, promptly lose the top one again in the process, and begin the entire hopeless ritual over from scratch, while a nearby nurse waits with the patient, weary expression of a woman who has personally witnessed this exact struggle several thousand times before. Then there is the matter of temperature. The ward itself is drafty in the particular way that only large, old, institutional buildings tend to be, and your gown offers roughly the thermal protection of a polite suggestion. Cold air finds you constantly, sliding up through the gap in the back like an unwelcome hand, settling into your spine, reminding you at every possible moment exactly how much of your body is currently on public display to a room full of strangers. You pull the thin blanket a little higher. You press your elbows tight against your sides. You develop, within about 24 hours, a permanent defensive hunch, a kind of protective curl specifically engineered to keep the worst of the draft off the parts of you that were never, under any circumstances, meant to encounter a draft in the first place. The real test arrives the moment you actually need to leave the bed. Perhaps you're being wheeled off for an examination, or perhaps, as a rare and special treat, you're permitted to shuffle to the bathroom under close supervision. This is where the gown reveals its true, villainous nature. You rise to your feet, and the fabric parts behind you like a theater curtain opening at the single worst possible moment. You reach back with one desperate hand to hold the whole thing closed, which means you now have exactly one functioning hand left over for everything else in life. For balance, for doors, for whatever remains of your composure. You shuffle down the central aisle, clutching the fabric shut like a Roman senator who has just lost a very expensive wager, past rows of fellow patients who have all made this exact, undignified pilgrimage themselves, and know precisely how it feels. You would think that in a building full of otherwise clever, capable people, somebody might have solved this particular design flaw by now. But the truth is the gown was never really designed with your comfort in mind at all. It was designed for the convenience of the staff, for quick access, for rapid changing, for the ease of everyone in the room, except the one person actually wearing the thing. Your dignity, quite simply, was never listed among the design specifications, and so you accept it, because acceptance turns out to be the only garment in this building that actually fits you properly. You are a patient now, and patients wear the thin sheet with the strings, and that, as they say, is simply that. By the end of your stay, you will have made a strange sort of peace with it. You will have mastered the one-handed clutch, the careful backward retreat into a chair, the subtle art of keeping the back closed through pure force of will alone. The gown will have won, as it always eventually does, and you will hand it back at discharge with the complicated, mixed emotions of a soldier returning a rifle he's grown oddly attached to. Somehow this flimsy little sheet becomes the very uniform of your total surrender, and you will have worn it without complaint for 7 consecutive days. Now that you are dressed, in the loosest possible interpretation of that word, let's go meet the women who actually run this entire operation. The nurses. Let's talk about the nurses, the true beating heart of this ward, and simultaneously, its strictest and most unforgiving border patrol. These women work absolutely brutal hours for modest pay and even less public credit, and a great many of them are, quite genuinely, angels wearing sensible shoes. But the system built around them is rigid to the point of near comedy. There is a spotless uniform, a starched cap folded into a precise shape that silently announces exactly which nursing school she trained at, and a chain of command so strict and so absolute that a junior nurse would sooner walk directly into traffic than dare question the head matron's judgment. Beds must be made with hospital corners sharp enough to genuinely injure an unsuspecting visitor. Charts must be filled out with total precision. Shoes must squeak against the tile in exactly the correct regulation manner. The uniform alone tells an entire story on its own. The dress is pressed to a knife's edge. The apron is blindingly, almost aggressively white. The cap is folded into a precise shape that took years of dedicated practice to master, and exactly one careless gust of wind to completely ruin. Every pin sits exactly where it should. Every hem falls to the regulation length, no more, no less. A nurse can be inspected from head to toe at literally any moment of any shift, and often is. And a single smudge or one loose thread is treated as something close to a minor moral failing. These women present themselves each and every morning as spotless as the ward they are personally responsible for commanding. Because, in this era, looking absolutely immaculate is treated as living proof that the job itself is being done correctly, whether or not the two things actually have anything to do with one another. The hierarchy is where matters become genuinely serious. At the very top sits the matron, a figure of near mythical authority whose approval is rare enough to be treasured, and whose displeasure arrives like a sudden change in the weather. Beneath her, the ward sisters, each running her own section with something close to military precision. Beneath them, the staff nurses, and beneath them, the student nurses who scurry about performing the hardest, least glamorous work in the entire building, while absorbing a more or less constant stream of correction from every direction at once. Rank in this world is everything. A junior nurse does not speak out of turn, does not question a direct order, and absolutely does not volunteer an opinion unless one has been specifically, explicitly requested of her, which is almost never. The entire structure runs on obedience flowing steadily downhill, and blame flowing right back up it just as steadily. For you, the patient lying in the bed, all of this rigid order has a genuine upside. Your bed will be made with terrifying, almost unsettling competence. Your medications will arrive precisely on schedule, down to the minute. The floors will gleam. The whole ward will click along like a well-oiled machine, because a machine is very nearly what this place has been built, quite deliberately, to resemble. There is real comfort in that kind of reliability. When you are frightened and far from your own home, the simple sight of a calm nurse moving briskly through her rounds, everything precisely where it belongs, can serve as its own quiet form of reassurance. Somebody, at least, appears to know exactly what is happening here, even if nobody will actually tell you what it is. But that same rigidity has real teeth. Rules are followed here because they are rules, full stop. Not always because following them genuinely helps the patient in question. Visiting hours are enforced down to the exact minute. Lights go out on a strict, unbending schedule, whether or not you personally happen to be ready for sleep. A kind-hearted nurse, who might otherwise bend a rule for a suffering patient, risks the very real wrath of the entire chain of command sitting above her. And so real kindness survives here, but quietly, tucked into a gentle word, exchanged in passing, or an extra blanket smuggled over when no senior staff member happens to be watching. The warmth is genuine. It simply has to survive inside a system that doesn't always leave a great deal of room for it to breathe. And so, over the course of your stay, you learn to read them, these women in their perfectly starched caps. You learn which one will slow down just long enough to actually explain something to you in plain language. Which one will politely pretend not to notice that you're still awake well past lights out. Which one seems to be holding the entire ward together through sheer, quiet force of will alone. They are overworked, chronically underappreciated, and holding this whole institution up with their own bare, endlessly scrubbed hands. But there is one figure in this building that even the formidable matron straightens her spine for. You can hear the entire ward shift the very moment he arrives. Let's go meet the doctor. The doctor's rounds. Let's talk, appropriately enough, about royalty. Because in the 1950s, the physician is not merely an expert in his field. He is something closer to an oracle, a small local monarch, a walking pronouncement delivered from on high, usually male, almost universally certain of himself, and very nearly never questioned by anyone in the building, staff or patient alike. When he sweeps onto the ward, a hush genuinely falls over the room. Nurses part like a curtain being drawn open, and you are somehow expected to feel a flicker of gratitude that he has bothered to notice your existence at all. He speaks about you quite openly in the third person while standing directly beside your bed, discussing the private contents of your body with a small cluster of students, as though you were a mildly interesting, weather pattern rather than an actual frightened human being lying 18 inches away from him. You hear him coming before you ever actually see him. A change moves through the ward, the way pressure drops before an approaching storm. Nurses stand up a little straighter. Charts are snatched up and squared neatly away. The low background chatter dies out almost instantly. Then the double doors swing wide, and in he comes, coat pressed crisp and white, telling a respectful little comet's tale of junior doctors and wide-eyed students hanging on his every syllable. He doesn't so much walk through the ward as process through it, pausing briefly at each bed to deliver his verdict before sailing smoothly onward to the next one. You have the distinct and rather odd sensation of being visited by an extremely busy king who has graciously agreed to tour his peasants for the morning. At your particular bedside, the performance truly begins. He lifts your chart, frowns down at it thoughtfully, and then, still holding it, begins describing your specific case to the assembled students, as though you were a diagram bolted to the wall, rather than an actual frightened person lying directly beneath him. He gestures at the relevant part of your anatomy. He poses questions to the students and lets them attempt to answer, correcting their mistakes with a dry, faintly amused smile. Your body has, in this moment, become a teaching aid, and nobody has bothered to formally introduce the two of you. Occasionally, and only occasionally, he addresses a remark directly to you. Usually, it's a brisk instruction of some kind, and you respond with the eager, grateful politeness of someone who has just been granted an audience with royalty. Questions from you are not technically forbidden, but they are certainly not encouraged either. Ask what exactly is wrong with you, and you may receive a vague, soothing phrase specifically designed to close the subject rather than open it up for genuine discussion. Ask what a particular treatment is actually meant to do, and you may be told, kindly, but quite firmly, that this is simply not something you need to trouble your mind over. The doctor knows. The doctor has already decided. Your job as the patient is to trust and comply. And the entire architecture of this ward, from the matron all the way down to the newest student nurse, is built specifically to reinforce exactly that arrangement. Second opinions are simply not a habit here. There's nowhere convenient to go looking for one, and no polite, socially acceptable way to even ask. The strange thing is that a great deal of this confidence is, in fact, genuinely earned. These are, by and large, dedicated and rigorously trained men who have given their entire adult lives over to the practice of medicine and who sincerely intend to heal you. Their certainty is built on real skill and real, hard-won knowledge. And in an age before patients could simply look anything up for themselves, that particular certainty functioned as a kind of anchor. When the doctor pronounced, with total confidence, that you would recover, the entire ward believed him without hesitation. And belief, as it turns out, is not nothing at all when you're lying frightened in an iron bed, far from home. But that pedestal comes with a real cost attached. A doctor who is never questioned is also, by definition, a doctor who is never meaningfully checked. And certainty left entirely untroubled by doubt can carry a person quite confidently in exactly the wrong direction. Mistakes made from the very top of a pedestal are extraordinarily difficult for anyone standing below to point out, let alone correct. You lie there and place your entire trust in a man whose word functions as law, hoping fervently that the law happens to be correct. Because you have been handed absolutely no tools with which to know otherwise. And there is one particular thing this all-knowing figure may already know, and may have quietly decided that you, specifically, are not allowed to know. Let's talk about the diagnosis nobody in this building is willing to tell you. The diagnosis nobody will tell you. Here is a detail guaranteed to make your modern skin crawl a little. In this era, your doctor may know precisely what is wrong with you and simply choose not to mention it. Withholding a serious diagnosis, particularly a frightening one, is considered, at the time, not an act of cruelty, but an act of kindness. A way of shielding your delicate constitution from bad news you might not be equipped to carry. Your own family might be pulled aside and told the full, unfiltered truth in a quiet hallway conversation by a window, while you lie in bed a few dozen feet away, quietly inventing your own private theories. A grim word may be written directly onto your chart in Latin, specifically so that you, the patient, cannot read it. You are, in a strange sense, the main character of your own illness, and simultaneously, the very last person invited to the actual discussion of it. It sounds unthinkable from where you're sitting now, decades removed. And yet, at the time, this was simply considered good manners, standard, respectable medical practice. The prevailing wisdom of the era held that a frightening diagnosis could do a patient more harm than the underlying disease itself, sapping the will to fight, crushing hope outright, and hastening exactly the decline that everyone in the room was desperately trying to avoid. And so a kind of protective silence settled quietly over the very worst news. The doctor would speak to your husband, or your wife, or your grown children in low tones near a window somewhere down the hall. They would nod. They would dab quietly at their eyes. And then they would return to your bedside wearing carefully rearranged, cheerful faces, assuring you that everything was coming along wonderfully. So you lie there in a peculiar sort of fog. You know, on some level, that you feel genuinely unwell. You notice the worried glances that people around you hastily rearrange into smiles the very instant you happen to look their way. You notice that certain direct questions produce only vague, evasive answers, and that certain specific words never seem to be spoken aloud in your presence. The one piece of information you most desperately want, the plain, unvarnished truth about your own body, is precisely the one thing this entire building has silently agreed to keep just barely out of your reach. You become, almost without meaning to, an amateur detective investigating your own case, reading faces, weighing the length of pauses, trying to assemble something resembling the truth out of the shape of the silence surrounding you. The tools of this particular concealment are everywhere, once you know to look for them. The chart hangs at the foot of your bed in handwriting you cannot begin to decipher, its most important words disguised in medical Latin like a private code. Conversations shift abruptly to bright, empty topics the very instant you tune back in. Even the kindest nurse on the floor, who might genuinely long to tell you plainly what's happening, remains bound by the doctor's decision, and by the iron chain of command sitting above her. Everyone around you is being gentle with you, and that gentleness itself becomes its own peculiar kind of loneliness. A soft wall quietly keeping you sealed off from the details of your own life. There is, to be entirely fair, a real and genuine tenderness buried somewhere inside all of this. The people carrying out this practice are not villains in any meaningful sense. They are simply following the best available thinking of their own day, and that thinking sincerely believed that hope itself functioned as medicine, and that a shielded patient was, in some genuine sense, a stronger one. Families kept these particular secrets out of real love, quietly carrying a terrible emotional weight so that you personally wouldn't have to. In a world with far fewer available treatments and much blunter medical tools, protecting a person's spirit sometimes felt like the only meaningful gift of care left to offer. But the cost of this practice was heavy, and later generations would come to see it with much greater clarity. A person kept deliberately in the dark cannot make real, informed choices about how they wish to spend whatever time remains to them. They cannot put their personal affairs in order. They cannot say the things that badly need saying to the people they love. They cannot decide for themselves exactly how they wish to face whatever is coming. The basic idea that a patient holds a right to the plain truth about their own body is a quiet revolution still waiting patiently in the wings, decades away from arriving. For now, though, you must simply lie here and guess, surrounded by kind, familiar faces that seem to know a great deal more about you than you are currently permitted to know about yourself. And where exactly is all of this carefully hidden knowledge actually written down? Let's take a much closer look at that mysterious clipboard hanging just barely out of your reach. The chart is where your entire existence at the moment is being recorded, cramped handwriting, tidy little columns of numbers, abbreviations that mean absolutely nothing to you and mean everything to the people reading them. Temperature, pulse, the color of certain bodily details best left politely undescribed. All of it noted down with the calm, detached efficiency of a shopkeeper quietly counting inventory. You are desperate to sneak even a single glance at it, and you can never quite manage it, because the instant you reach toward it, a nurse materializes at your elbow as though summoned by some invisible bell. It hangs there on its little metal hook, mere inches beyond your fingertips, taunting you gently all day long. People you have genuinely never met approach the foot of your bed, lift the board, study it with serious, unreadable expressions, jot something down in silence, and hang it back up without a single word directed your way. You crane your neck. You squint hard. You catch a fleeting glimpse of a rising line on some kind of graph, or a small cluster of letters, and you try desperately to decode exactly what it might mean for your future. It feels a bit like watching a group of total strangers read your private diary, aloud to one another in shifts. while you yourself remain strictly forbidden from ever opening it. The language of the chart functions as its own small fortress. The handwriting is the famously illegible scrawl of overworked medical men, looping, hurried, and barely legible, even to people specifically trained to read it. The abbreviations form a kind of private code, whole sentences compressed down into 3 or 4 letters that the staff understand instantly and that you cannot begin to guess at. Numbers march steadily down the page in tidy columns, quietly tracking parts of your body that you didn't even realize were being counted at all. Everything about the document is designed purely for speed and purely for the convenience of the people writing in it. Absolutely nothing about it is designed to be understood by the one person it actually describes. And yet that chart remains, in a real sense, the truest existing portrait of you anywhere in the building. It knows your exact temperature at 3 in the morning, recorded while you were sound asleep, and never felt the thermometer at all. It records every single dose of every medicine you've been given, every meal you managed to finish, every restless, sleepless night. It carries the doctor's private notes, his suspicions, his conclusions, and perhaps the very diagnosis that nobody in this building is willing to say aloud in your presence. Somewhere in those cramped lines lives the actual version of you that the hospital is genuinely acting upon. And that version may not match at all the reassuring version being spoken aloud at your bedside. The gap between those two versions is exactly where your unease quietly lives. The nurses guard this document with a devotion that would genuinely impress a dragon. Reach for it, and one appears instantly at your elbow, gently but firmly steering your hand away. It isn't personal. The chart is simply considered a working professional document, a tool of the trade, and allowing patients to pore over it is simply not how things are done in this particular era. There's also, unspoken beneath all of it, the quiet question of what exactly you might read there, and how badly it might upset you, which loops us directly back to all the truths this era generally prefers to keep politely folded away out of sight. The clipboard, in the end, is not merely a record. It is a small, locked door, and you happen to be standing on the wrong side of it, so you make do with whatever fragments you can gather. You learn to read the nurse's face carefully as she updates it, hunting for the smallest flicker of good news or bad. You count exactly how long the doctor lingers over it during his rounds. You treat every raised eyebrow, every thoughtful hum, as a small clue in the ongoing mystery of your own body. It is an exhausting way to spend a week being sick, forever reaching for a single document that holds every answer you actually want, and forever being pulled gently, politely back. But some portion of what fills that chart comes from a particular procedure, repeated at your bedside several times each and every day. And it involves a piece of equipment you are about to become far too intimately familiar with. The needle. Let's talk about the needle. It is, once again, time for your injection. So try your very best to stay calm. In the 1950s, the syringe itself is a solid, heavy contraption built from glass and metal. And here comes the genuinely charming part. It is reusable. So is the needle attached to it. Both get carefully boiled, wiped down, and sent back out into service like loyal little soldiers returning to duty. And a busy nurse might reasonably carry the very same instrument from bed to bed with a briskness that would give a modern infection control officer an actual heart event. Needles, when they grow dull from repeated use, are sharpened again by hand, which means the one about to enter your arm may currently have roughly the delicate finesse of a garden trowel. Let's appreciate the object itself for a moment. This is not the light, disposable syringe of later decades, used exactly once and dropped casually into a bin. This is a substantial instrument of glass and steel, cleaned, cared for, and pressed back into service again and again and again. It lives in a metal tray, gets boiled thoroughly between shifts, and is treated throughout as permanent, valuable equipment rather than as something to be casually thrown away. In an era built around genuine thrift, wasting a perfectly functional needle would strike most people as faintly ridiculous. And so, the needle earns its keep day after day, patient after patient, a hard-working little veteran of the ward. The sharpening process is where things become genuinely memorable. A needle used many times over grows dull, and a dull needle becomes a hooked, clumsy little instrument. So someone on staff wets the point by hand to restore its edge. The results, understandably, vary quite a bit. On a good day, the tip is keen, and the injection itself is quick and nearly painless. On a less fortunate day, the point has roughly the delicate precision of a nail, and the resulting injection becomes an event you'll be describing to relatives for years to come. You watch the nurse approach, tray balanced in hand, and you clench every single muscle in your body, which, of course, does not help in the slightest, but at least feels like you're doing something proactive. Now for the detail that will genuinely raise the hair on your modern arms. The very same syringe, occasionally the very same needle, travels methodically along the entire row of beds, pausing briefly at each patient in turn. A quick wipe, a fresh vial, and onward to the next bed. Germ theory absolutely exists by this point in history, is taught in every medical school, and is accepted by every practicing physician. The staff genuinely do sterilize their equipment through boiling, and they truly believe they are being appropriately careful. But the deep, obsessive, single-use caution of later decades simply has not arrived yet, and the full understanding of exactly how infection can hitch a ride from one patient to the next, by way of shared equipment, is still, quietly, catching up to itself. None of this, however, is currently the point. The point, right now, is that a large, freshly resharpened needle is heading directly toward your arm, held by a woman who performs this exact procedure perhaps 40 times a day, and is not remotely nervous about doing it, which which is somehow both deeply comforting and mildly alarming at the very same time. You're told to relax your arm completely. You do not relax your arm at all. She finds her mark regardless, and there's a firm, steady pressure, followed by a deep, spreading ache that announces the medicine has officially arrived. You exhale slowly. You have survived it, and you know, with grim certainty, that another round is coming in just a few hours. The medicine itself may well be doing you genuine, measurable good, and the nurse wielding that needle is sincerely trying to heal you with the very best tools her era happens to provide. But the reused, resharpened, ward-roaming syringe is exactly the sort of detail that later generations will look back on with a visible shudder, quietly grateful for the eventual invention of simply throwing things away. For now, though, it is simply part of the daily rhythm, as ordinary as the tea trolley, and considerably less welcome. Speaking of things that visit your bedside on a relentless, unbroken schedule, let's talk about the small glass tube that arrives every few hours to measure your temperature, thermometer, and pulse. Every few hours, day and night, without exception, someone arrives at your bedside to take your temperature. The thermometer itself is a slim glass tube filled with mercury, and it goes exactly where you're afraid it might. It gets rinsed, given a brisk shake to send the mercury back down, and passed along to the very next patient at a speed that suggests nobody has thought particularly hard about the journey. This one small tube has already taken through the ward. Your pulse, meanwhile, is counted the old-fashioned way. A nurse holding your wrist gently, squinting at the second hand of a watch pinned to her apron. Your blood pressure, if it's measured at all during your stay, comes from a cuff and a fairly stern expression. Consider, for a moment, the humble thermometer, the ward's most tireless traveler. It is a delicate wand of glass with a thin silver thread of mercury inside, and it must be held carefully in place for a good long while in order to coax out an accurate reading, which means you lie there in enforced stillness, feeling faintly ridiculous the entire time. When your allotted minutes are up, the nurse retrieves it, holds it up to the light, squints at the tiny line, and records the number carefully on your ever-hungry chart. Then comes the brisk rinse, the practiced shake to send the mercury back down, and the quiet handoff to the very next patient in line. The same small tube, making its patient rounds up and down the entire row of beds. The pulse taking, by contrast, is a beautifully human little ritual. No machine involved. No glowing digital display. Just a nurse's cool fingers pressed gently to your wrist, and her eyes fixed steadily on the second hand of her pinned watch. She counts in complete silence, her lips barely moving, and you find yourself holding your own breath, almost as if you might somehow throw off her careful tally. In 15 or 30 seconds, she has your heartbeat measured, performs a small mental calculation, and moves on to the next bed. It's an old, quietly impressive skill, and it depends entirely on her attention and her mental arithmetic, rather than on any beeping electronic box. What strikes you most, once you've settled into the rhythm of it, is the sheer silence of the place. There are no monitors here, no gentle electronic chirp reassuring the room that hearts continue beating and lungs continue filling with air. No screen mounted above your bed tracing glowing lines through the darkness of the night. If something inside your body begins to go quietly wrong between one scheduled check and the next, there is no alarm standing by to catch it. Only the next scheduled visit from a nurse carrying her watch and her thermometer. Your safety, in a very real sense, rests entirely on the rounds being properly kept, and the eyes doing the checking being genuinely sharp. On human vigilance, rather than on tireless machinery standing guard, which brings us, inevitably, to the great indignity of the 3 a.m. check. You will have finally, blessedly drifted off, chasing a precious few hours of genuine sleep, when a soft footstep and a cool hand gently rouse you back to the surface. Time for your temperature. You blink hard into the dim ward light, submit patiently to the little glass tube, offer up your wrist without complaint, and are told in a kind whisper that you're doing just fine and may go right back to sleep now, which, of course, you cannot, because you are now wide awake and mildly outraged, staring up at the ceiling and composing complaints you will never actually deliver to anyone. And yet, there is something almost tender buried in all of it. Someone, somewhere, is quietly counting your heartbeats through the depths of the night. Someone is walking the hushed ward with a watch and a small notebook, checking in turn on every sleeping stranger, making sure the numbers hold steady until the sun comes up. It is care delivered entirely by hand, without a single machine standing in to help, resting entirely on the steady attention of tired women in perfectly starched caps. Primitive, certainly, and shared in ways that would genuinely horrify a modern eye, but human, right down to the fingertips. So there you have it, the daily rhythm of measurement that fills your chart and reliably interrupts your sleep. Now that you've been thoroughly poked, counted, and recorded, let's turn to something you will come to actively dread 3 separate times a day. The food. Let's talk about mealtimes, because apparently your entire recovery hinges on consuming food that has personally given up on itself. The 1950s hospital tray is a monument to the boiled, the beige, and the aggressively bland. There's broth roughly the color of dishwater, a small scoop of something that may, at one distant point in its life, have been a vegetable, a single slice of white bread, and a wobbling square of gelatin standing in, simultaneously, for dessert, joy, and hope itself. Flavor, in this building, is viewed with deep and genuine suspicion, as though a single pinch of pepper might somehow undo an entire surgical procedure. The meal trolley arrives with a distinctive rattle you'll learn to recognize from 3 beds away, and the whole ward turns toward it with the guarded hope of people who know better and simply cannot help themselves anyway. Metal covers are lifted one at a time, releasing a faint curl of steam, and a smell that lands somewhere between a school cafeteria and a busy laundry room. Beneath each cover waits the same careful arrangement of soft, pale, entirely unthreatening food, portioned with a nurse's precise efficiency, and seasoned, quite deliberately, with almost nothing at all. You're meant to find all of this comforting. Mostly, you find it educational, a genuine lesson in exactly how much a person can come to miss a simple onion. There is, to be fair, a real philosophy behind all this blandness, and it is sincerely held. The prevailing thinking holds that an ailing stomach wants nothing remotely challenging placed in front of it. That spice and richness represent an unnecessary burden on a body already working hard to heal itself. And that plain, soft, thoroughly boiled food is simply the gentlest possible thing you can offer a recovering patient. So the kitchen boils away with genuine conviction. Meat is stewed until it fully surrenders. Vegetables are cooked until they seem to forget they were ever vegetables in the first place. Everything on the tray is made easy to chew, easy to swallow, and easy to forget entirely the moment it's gone. Nourishment, not pleasure, is the entire stated goal here, and pleasure, notably, was never invited to the planning meeting if you happen to be placed on a special restricted diet. And a great many patients are the tray grows even more austere still. Salt may be forbidden outright. Fat may be forbidden as well. Whole categories of flavor simply vanish in the name of your recovery, leaving you staring down at a landscape of white and pale yellow, a kind of still life in quiet surrender. You poke at it. You rearrange it thoughtfully across the plate. You eat the gelatin first, because the gelatin, whatever else might be said about it, at least commits fully to being something, quivering there in cheerful, wobbly defiance of all the beige surrounding it. Eating itself becomes a small ordeal, thanks entirely to the bed. You're propped upright at an angle, apparently designed by someone who has personally never attempted to eat a meal lying down, balancing a tray on a wheeled table that swings frustratingly out of reach the moment you lean forward to reach it. Soup becomes an actual feat of engineering. Breadcrumbs migrate steadily into the sheets, where they will keep you company for the remainder of the night. You manage a few careful, deliberate spoonfuls. Tell yourself firmly that it's doing you good, and hand the tray back only slightly emptier than it arrived, to the mild, visible disappointment of a nurse who would very much have preferred that you clean your plate entirely. And yet, hunger turns out to be a remarkably persuasive teacher. By the third day of your stay, that same dishwater-colored broth begins to look almost genuinely appealing. The gelatin becomes a real event, arguably the highlight of an otherwise long, flat, featureless afternoon. You find yourself actively listening for the distant rattle of the trolley, not with dread anymore, but with something dangerously close to real anticipation. Because when your entire world has shrunk down to a single bed and a single ceiling, even a thoroughly bland meal becomes a happening. A small, welcome break in the endless sameness of the day. The food itself hasn't improved one bit. Your standards have simply come down to meet it where it lives. So you eat what you reasonably can. Keep your quiet opinions carefully to yourself, and let the Beige get on with its gentle, thankless work. But there is one item sitting on your bedside table that everyone in this building seems to genuinely agree is good for you, and it will thoroughly astonish your modern lungs: the cigarettes. Now brace yourself, because you are, in fact, permitted to smoke in bed. And so, it seems, is nearly everyone else currently occupying this ward. In this era, the cigarette isn't merely tolerated inside a hospital. It is practically prescribed outright. Ashtrays sit on bedside tables like small, cheerful welcome gifts. Patients puff away contentedly between coughing fits. Visitors light up casually right beside them, and the doctor himself may pause briefly during his rounds to enjoy one, sometimes appearing in a magazine advertisement where he cheerfully recommends a particular brand as being especially gentle on your throat. The whole ward hangs suspended in a soft, permanent blue haze, and remarkably, nobody here finds this the slightest bit unusual. Look around the room, and you'll see it absolutely everywhere. The man in the next bed lights up the moment his breakfast tray is cleared away, drawing deeply as though the smoke itself were a form of medicine. A nurse empties his ashtray with the exact same brisk efficiency she brings to plumping his pillow moments later. Cigarettes are handed out freely to soothe the nerves of anxious patients, offered to visitors as a simple courtesy, and enjoyed by the staff themselves during their brief, precious breaks. Little glowing points of orange light drift across the darkened ward at night, like a scattering of patient fireflies. In this building devoted entirely to the pursuit of health, tobacco is treated as simply one of life's ordinary small comforts, no more remarkable, really, than a cup of tea. The culture surrounding it runs remarkably deep. This is an age when the cigarette has woven itself into virtually everything. Into films, into office life, into dinner tables, into doctors' own waiting rooms. Advertisements feature confident men in crisp white coats endorsing their preferred brand, assuring the watching public that it is gentle, that it soothes an irritated throat, that discerning physicians genuinely choose it for themselves. The message is everywhere, and it is broadly trusted, precisely because doctors themselves are trusted. And if the doctor standing in front of you happens to be smoking one himself while examining you, what possible harm could there realistically be? For you, the patient, this presents a rather strange scene to take in. You lie in your bed, recovering from whatever originally brought you here, breathing air you could very nearly slice and serve on a plate. The smoke gathers slowly near the high ceiling, softening the light overhead, settling quietly into the curtains, the bed linens, and quite possibly your own recovering lungs. If you happen to be a smoker yourself, you find the whole arrangement rather agreeable, reaching for the ashtray in the gaps between the nurse's rounds. If you're not a smoker, you learn quickly to breathe a little more shallowly and to accept that the air in this room belongs to everyone present. And everyone present has apparently decided to fill it generously with tobacco smoke. The quiet tragedy hiding inside all of this is that the truth is only just now beginning to surface, out beyond these walls. In these very same years, researchers elsewhere are quietly assembling the evidence that will eventually change absolutely everything. Linking the beloved cigarette directly to many of the very diseases these wards are currently full of treating. The findings are coming. They simply haven't yet won over the room. The habit itself is far too comfortable, far too deeply woven into daily American life, far too profitable, and far too familiar to be dislodged easily by the concerns of a few worried scientists. And so the haze lingers on. The ashtrays stay exactly where they are. The doctor continues recommending his preferred brand to anyone who will listen. Later generations will find it almost impossible to believe that a place specifically built to heal the sick once actively encouraged the very habit, making so many of its patients sick in the first place. But that is, nonetheless, the strange, smoke-wreathed truth of this particular era. You're welcome to light up. The doctor approves, and the entire ward agrees, without exception, that it does a body good, right up until the precise moment history proves otherwise. The pharmacy of wonders. Let's talk about the medicine cabinet, because the 1950s are, quite frankly, intoxicated by their own recent success. Penicillin has arrived, the genuine wonder drug that can suddenly cure conditions that, only a decade earlier, reliably killed people. And everyone involved is understandably thrilled about it. The trouble is that thrill tips over into enthusiasm remarkably quickly, and antibiotics soon begin getting prescribed for absolutely everything. A sniffle, a bad mood, possibly even a squeaky door hinge, if you asked the right pharmacist on the right afternoon. Nobody yet worries about overusing these drugs, because the very idea that a miracle could ever stop working sounds, to this era, like pure science fiction. You have to understand just how genuinely miraculous this must have seemed at the time. Only a short while earlier, a simple infection could carry off a perfectly healthy person within a matter of days. A minor scratch could turn fatal. A routine childhood illness could empty an entire household of children within a single season. Then came the antibiotics, and suddenly diseases that had terrified families for centuries could be beaten back decisively with nothing more than a short course of injections. Doctors who had spent entire careers helplessly watching patients slip away from infections they simply could not touch now held the actual cure in their own two hands. It felt like magic. And in a very real sense, it was. And the sheer joy of that discovery swept through the medical profession like sunrise breaking after an extraordinarily long night. But triumph, as it tends to do, has a way of tipping over into excess. If the wonder drug could cure the desperately, gravely ill, the reasoning naturally went, Surely, it could also help the merely mildly unwell, the person with an ordinary ache, the person who simply wanted extra peace of mind. And so the antibiotics began flowing rather freely, prescribed generously for coughs and colds they could do absolutely nothing to fix, for vague aches and general complaints, dispensed with all the confident generosity of people who genuinely believe they've finally found an answer to everything. Why hold back a miracle, after all? Why not share it around as widely as possible? The little glass vials and paper cups multiplied across the ward, and the entire room hummed along with a quiet, shared certainty that modern medicine had, at long last, truly won. For you, this means your own paper cup of pills, or your own scheduled injection, is quite likely to include one of these marvels, whether or not your particular ailment actually happens to be the sort of thing it can genuinely fix. You take it gratefully anyway, because everyone around you speaks of these drugs in tones bordering on reverence, and because in the mind of this era, more medicine simply means better, more thorough care by definition. The neighbor in the next bed gets his dose. The patient across the aisle gets hers. The entire ward is being generously dosed with the wonders of the age. And the prevailing mood is one of pure, uncomplicated optimism. And here is exactly where the shadow falls. The one nobody currently standing in this room is able to see. Used this freely, this casually, these miracle drugs are quietly, invisibly teaching the very bacteria they're meant to defeat exactly how to survive them. Every unnecessary dose hands the hardiest surviving bacteria a small chance to adapt, to shrug off the assault, and to pass that hard-won resistance along to the next generation. The seeds of an enormous future problem are being planted right here, in these hopeful, sunlit wards, all under the sincere belief that a genuine miracle could never possibly run dry. The bill for all of this enthusiasm will come due decades from now, long after everyone currently standing in this room has moved on with their lives. But that particular reckoning belongs to tomorrow. Right now, in this ward, on this day, is a time of genuine celebration. The wonder drug works. Lives that would otherwise have been lost are being saved in real time. And medicine, quite reasonably, has every reason in the world to feel proud of itself. You swallow your dose and join the general mood of optimism, blissfully unaware that generosity with a miracle can carry a hidden cost of its own, waiting patiently down the road. The hospital pharmacy, though, has more than just the one marvel on offer. The next two arrive on a gentle, almost cheerful daily schedule, designed specifically to put you down for the night and lift you right back up again by morning. Pep pills and sleeping pills. Here is a delightful little routine you'll grow quite accustomed to during your stay. In the evening, a nurse arrives bearing a small paper cup containing a barbiturate meant to ease you into sleep, because rest in this building is treated as sacred, and the ward itself is loud enough at night to wake the dead. Then, come morning, you may well be offered something to perk you right back up again, an amphetamine, handed over as casually as a breath mint. Down at night, up again in the morning, up again the next day after that. A gentle chemical seesaw that the medicine of this particular era considers perfectly sensible, even admirable. The evening ritual arrives first. As the ward begins to settle and the overhead lights start to dim, the nurse makes her rounds, carrying a small tray of paper cups, and resting in yours sits a capsule promising an entire night of untroubled, dreamless sleep. You're genuinely grateful for it, truly, because the open ward by night is a full symphony of snoring, coughing, distant footsteps, and the occasional far-off rattle of a trolley. And drifting off unaided in the middle of all, that racket would honestly qualify as a small heroic feat. So you swallow the pill, sink gratefully into your pillow, and feel a heavy, welcome fog roll gently in and switch off the noise entirely. Sleep, in this place, is not something you have to earn through effort. It is something you are simply issued, right on schedule. Then comes the morning, and with it, for a great many patients, a gentle chemical nudge sent firmly in the opposite direction. That heavy fog from the night before doesn't always lift entirely on its own. And a groggy patient, as it happens, tends to be a rather gloomy patient. So the era has developed a tidy answer for that particular problem as well. A small something to sharpen you right back up, to chase away the lingering haze, to get you bright-eyed and reasonably cheerful in time for the doctor's morning rounds. It's handed over with exactly the same easy, casual confidence as everything else in this building. No real fuss, no particular warning, just a small pill meant to help you properly meet the day ahead. Down at night, up again in the morning, the pendulum swinging steadily along, right on schedule. Nobody on this ward finds any of this the least bit strange, because the whole surrounding society treats these particular substances with a remarkable, almost breezy casualness. Pills to induce sleep and pills to chase away drowsiness are woven generously into ordinary daily life well beyond these hospital walls, prescribed freely to the busy, the tired, the tense, and the merely mildly restless. The notion that these substances might quietly grip a person over time, that the body might come to genuinely lean on them, that stopping might prove its own particular kind of difficulty, is a distant, rather unwelcome idea that this era largely prefers not to dwell on for very long. These, after all, are simply helpful modern conveniences, and helpful modern conveniences exist to be enjoyed, not fretted over unnecessarily. So you settle comfortably into the rhythm of it, because resisting the current would mean swimming rather stubbornly against the entire tide of the place. The evening capsule becomes something you genuinely look forward to, your reliable ticket out of the noisy ward and off into peaceful oblivion. The morning pick-me-up becomes the thing that reliably makes you feel human again. Within just a few days, the whole seesaw begins to feel almost entirely natural. Your moods, your energy levels, handed to you in small paper cups on a schedule set entirely by someone else. Your own body, in a quiet sort of way, gently outsourced to the pharmacy down the hall. The reckoning, as with so much else in this building, waits patiently somewhere off in the future. The full understanding of exactly how habit-forming these particular pills can become, of the quiet dependence they're capable of breeding over time, is still slowly catching up to the enthusiasm currently on display for handing them out so freely. For now, they're simply considered part of good, thorough care, dispensed with a warm smile and swallowed without a second thought. The gentle chemical machinery that quietly runs your days and your nights while you lie there and simply let it, chemically balanced, thoroughly medicated, and for the moment, at least, feeling reasonably at peace with the whole arrangement. You're now, as it happens, ready for the hospital's other great enthusiasm, the one that involves a large, humming machine and a generous, entirely invisible beam. The X-ray, time, apparently, for a few pictures of your insides. And the hospital could not possibly be more delighted about the prospect. The 1950s are wildly, unreservedly in love with the X-ray machine, and it gets pointed at nearly every patient for nearly every complaint imaginable, often more than once, with remarkably little thought given to the cumulative total dose involved. Protective shielding, where it exists at all, is minimal. The exposures themselves run considerably longer than modern standards would ever permit, and in this particular era, you can genuinely wander into an ordinary shoe shop and slide your own feet into a glowing box, just to admire the bones inside your new shoes purely for the novelty of it. The machine itself is a serious, imposing contraption. All metal arms and heavy housing, wheeled into position over whichever part of you happens to be in question, with all the ceremony the moment seems to deserve. You're told to hold perfectly still, to hold your breath, to avoid so much as a twitch while the thing hums, clicks, and quietly does its invisible work. A moment later, somewhere in a back room, a ghostly gray image of your own skeleton materializes on a glass plate, your bones laid bare like a small, private secret. It genuinely is marvelous. A literal window straight through your own flesh. And you can understand entirely why this entire era fell so hard for the technology. Because fall for it, they absolutely did. The X-ray gets aimed at nearly every complaint that walks through the front door, and frequently several times over. Because if one picture proves useful, then surely additional pictures must be even more useful still. Broken bones, sore chests, aching stomachs, uncertain diagnoses of every description. All of it earns a trip beneath the beam. Follow-up images are taken freely simply to check on progress. The machine works hard, day in and day out, and each patient quietly accumulates exposure after exposure, with nobody keeping much of a running tally, because the running tally itself isn't yet considered to matter very much. The casualness surrounding all of this extends well beyond the hospital's own walls. And this is really where the era shows its true colors. Out in the ordinary world, you can walk into a shoe shop, slide your feet into a special glowing box built specifically for the purpose, and peer straight down at the bones of your own toes, wiggling comfortably inside your brand new shoes, purely for the fun and novelty of the thing. Children genuinely love it. Salesmen use it to demonstrate a good, snug fit. Nobody thinks twice about any of it, because radiation, at this point in history, is regarded as a clever and essentially harmless bit of modern wizardry. A tool with all upside and apparently no cost whatsoever, to be enjoyed as freely and casually as electric light itself. The shielding situation tells the whole story rather plainly. In this era, the heavy protective aprons, the careful standing distances, and the strict dose limits of later medicine are minimal at best, or entirely absent at worst. The beam itself is considerably stronger and lingers noticeably longer than it will in decades to come. And the technician operating the machine may well stand closer to it than any modern colleague would ever dream of doing. The invisible nature of the whole process makes it remarkably easy to simply ignore. You cannot see radiation. You cannot feel it. You cannot smell it in the air. And so it becomes very easy indeed to believe that it simply isn't there, doing anything at all out of sight, entirely out of mind, and currently pointed squarely at your chest for the third time this particular week. None of which is to suggest that the X-ray is anything less than a genuine triumph of modern medicine, because it absolutely is one, and it will go on to save and improve countless lives once its true power comes to be properly respected and carefully managed. The only real problem here is the era's boundless, entirely unguarded enthusiasm. The quiet, comfortable assumption that a good thing could never possibly carry a hidden price tag of its own. That respect, that caution, that careful running count of every single exposure, all of it still lies somewhere off in the future. For now, the beam is generous, the mood in the room is delighted, and you simply hold your breath and let the machine get on quietly with its ghostly work. But this era's genuine love affair with radiation doesn't stop at merely taking pictures. It also sincerely believes that the invisible beam itself can heal you directly. And remarkably, sometimes it's entirely right. The age of the radioactive cure, and it isn't only pictures either. In this era, radiation itself is administered as an actual treatment, aimed directly at tumors and various other ailments, with a confidence that is equal parts genuinely impressive and quietly unsettling. Radioactive iodine gets administered to calm an overactive thyroid gland. Focused beams are directed at troublesome growths in the sincere hope of shrinking them. Some of this work is entirely real, careful, serious medicine work that saves actual lives and will go on to form the backbone of cancer treatment for generations to come. And some of it, out in the wider world beyond the hospital, curdles rather quickly into outright quackery, complete with dubious tonics and strange little gadgets, all promising that a small dose of radioactivity will cure whatever happens to ail you. Inside the hospital itself, the serious, careful work is genuinely remarkable to witness. Doctors have discovered that the very same invisible energy capable of photographing your bones can also be turned deliberately against disease, focused precisely onto a tumor to weaken and gradually shrink it. A patient suffering from an overactive thyroid may be given a carefully measured dose of radioactive iodine, which travels directly to the affected gland and quietly settles it down. A piece of genuine cleverness that feels almost like science fiction brought to life. These are real, lasting advances, the direct ancestors of treatments that will one day help enormous numbers of people. Delivered here by careful, skilled hands who genuinely understand their working with something powerful and demanding real respect. You lie beneath the apparatus and place your entire trust in the people operating it, because trust, quite simply, is the only tool currently available to you. They position you carefully, tell you to remain perfectly still, and then step behind their own protective shielding to send the beam directly into you. You feel nothing at all, which is perhaps the strangest part of the whole experience. This profound, invisible force passing directly through your body without so much as a whisper of sensation. The doctors speak of the procedure with the same easy confidence they bring to absolutely everything else. And their confidence here is largely well earned, because in skilled hands, delivered in proper measured doses, this genuinely is legitimate, life-saving medical work. The real trouble lies at the edges, in the gap between the careful, disciplined science being practiced inside these walls and the era's giddy, uncritical faith in all things radioactive more broadly. Beyond the hospital, that broader faith has curdled into something considerably less respectable. The wider world of this era has been swept up in a genuine fascination with radioactivity, and opportunistic sellers have rushed eagerly to cash in on it, peddling tonics, creams, and strange little gadgets that promise a healthful dose of radiation for whatever happens to be troubling you. Feeling a bit tired, a few aches and pains, a splash of this miraculous invisible energy will surely set you right again. It is, quite simply, nonsense, and sometimes genuinely dangerous nonsense, dressed up carefully in the shining, reassuring language of modern science. The line separating the two, the careful, disciplined medicine on one side and the reckless quackery on the other, is blurrier than it really ought to be, because the entire era shares a single collective blind spot. Radiation is broadly understood to be powerful, yes, but the full weight of its genuine dangers, the way it can harm just as readily as it heals when handled carelessly, simply hasn't yet been burned into the common public understanding. The caution that later generations will rightly insist upon the strict limits, the deep and careful respect for the real risks involved, simply doesn't exist yet in its full and final form. And so, for now, the good and the foolish travel along side by side, both wrapped comfortably in the very same bright, confident glow. You, meanwhile, are receiving the genuine article here, real treatment from real, skilled doctors, and you're fortunate for it, because it may well be doing you profound and lasting good. You cannot see it. You cannot feel it. You cannot judge any of it for yourself. And so you do exactly what patients of this particular era always do. You lie still. You trust completely. And you let the invisible beam get on quietly with its work, hopping fervently that the hands guiding it genuinely know exactly what they're doing. If your particular week has taken a more serious turn, though, the beam alone may not prove sufficient, and you may well find yourself being wheeled toward a very different sort of room entirely. Let's walk together into the operating theater. The operating theater, if your particular week takes a surgical turn, let's walk together toward the operating theater. And yes, in this era, it is sometimes quite literally a theater, complete with tiered seating rising around the table, so that students and junior doctors can lean in and watch the proceedings unfold. You're wheeled down a corridor on a hard, narrow trolley, ceiling lights sliding past overhead in a strange, dreamlike procession, and delivered at last into a bright, tiled room that smells of soap and something sharper hiding just beneath it. The surgeon scrubs at a basin nearby, though perhaps not for quite as long as later generations would insist upon, and the instruments themselves gleam neatly on their tray, patiently waiting. The journey there is its own quiet ordeal in miniature. You're lifted onto the narrow trolley and rolled out of the familiar ward and into the unknown, staring straight up at a parade of ceiling lights sliding past you one after another, each one a small sun swimming briefly overhead before disappearing. The corridors turn. Doors swing open and shut. Voices murmur about you rather than to you. By the time you finally arrive at the theater itself, you've been thoroughly reminded that you are, for the moment, essentially cargo delivered wherever the schedule happens to require, with about as much say in the matter as a parcel being shipped across town. The room itself is bright to the point of severity. All hard tile and polished metal, lit so fiercely that shadows have virtually nowhere left to hide. The air carries the clean, sharp bite of disinfectant and soap, and underneath that fainter and considerably less reassuring, the sharper smell of the work that actually happens here. On a tray beside the table, surgical instruments lie arranged in gleaming, orderly rows, catching the light and waiting patiently for their moment. Masked figures move calmly about the space with practiced, unhurried efficiency, and you realize, somewhat unsettlingly, that you cannot tell any of them apart from one another. A room entirely full of eyes peering out above cloth, all of them briefly turned in your direction. And then there is the theater in the fullest possible sense of the word, because in this era, the room may genuinely be constructed like one, with tiered seating rising around the operating table, so that students and junior doctors can lean forward and observe closely. Surgery in this building is teaching as much as it is healing, and a good operation reliably draws an audience of the eager and the still learning, all peering down at the table where you currently lie. You are, for the duration of the procedure, the featured performance of the day, the case being studied and quietly discussed by a gallery of people whose names you will likely never learn. It is a strange, involuntary sort of fame, earned entirely by lying very still and being unwell. The surgeon presides over all of it, scrubbing his hands and forearms thoroughly at a basin before pulling on his gloves. A ritual of cleanliness that is genuinely real and genuinely important, though by the exacting standards of later decades, perhaps not quite thorough enough. Sterile technique has traveled a considerable distance from the horrors of earlier centuries, and the people working in this room genuinely understand that cleanliness saves lives, but it hasn't yet reached its final, obsessive state of perfection. Infection remains a real and patient danger lurking at the edges of even the most carefully performed procedure, ready at any moment to turn a successful operation into a difficult, drawn-out recovery. Still, there is deep, genuine skill at work in this room, and real courage present on both sides of the operating table. The surgeon has trained for years and carries with him the quiet confidence of hard-won experience. The team surrounding him moves with practiced, well-rehearsed coordination, anticipating, assisting, keeping the delicate machinery of the operation running smoothly from start to finish, whatever the genuine limits of this particular era. These are people bending every ounce of their considerable talent toward the single goal of putting you back together properly. And that, whatever else might be said about the room, is no small thing to place your faith in. You, of course, will witness almost none of it directly, which is entirely for the best. You simply have to lie back on that hard, bright table, breathe steadily, and surrender yourself completely to a room full of masked strangers. And this era's steady, imperfect, sincere best effort. But before any of that can actually begin, they must first send you somewhere very far away indeed, going under. Let's talk then about the part where they put you to sleep, because it is, in its own right, quite an event. Anesthesia in this era represents genuine, remarkable medical progress, and it is also, in its own quiet way, faintly terrifying to actually experience. A mask may be lowered gently over your face, and the sweet, choking smell of ether, or something closely resembling it, fills your entire world as a calm voice instructs you to begin counting slowly backward from 100. You will rarely make it much past 90. The doozing itself is considerably more art than precise science here, guided largely by the anesthetist's trained eye and years of accumulated experience, rather than by the precise electronic monitors of later decades. It begins gently enough. A calm figure appears at the head of the table, murmuring quiet reassurances, and lowers a mask toward your face with the unhurried, practiced manner of someone who has performed this exact ritual many thousands of times before. You're told to breathe normally, to relax completely, to count slowly backward, and you obey without hesitation, because obeying is simply what one does in a room like this. Then comes the smell, sweet, heavy, and entirely unmistakable, filling your nose, your throat, and your whole rapidly shrinking world. And you understand with sudden, startling clarity that this is genuinely, actually happening. The descent itself is peculiar and remarkably swift. You count 99, 98, and somewhere around 90. The numbers themselves begin sliding quietly away from you, growing thick and increasingly distant. The room softens noticeably at its edges. The bright overhead lights blur together. The voices around you stretch and warp strangely. There is a brief moment of floating, disorienting strangeness, not quite sleep, and not quite ordinary waking either. And then there is nothing at all. A clean, black gap opening up in your existence, into which the entire operation will vanish without leaving behind so much as a single memory. It is, in its own peculiar way, a small death and a scheduled resurrection, arriving conveniently on a Tuesday morning. The person guiding you carefully through all of this is working with considerably more raw skill than actual equipment. The dosing of anesthesia in this era leans heavily on the anesthetist's own trained eye, on watching your breathing carefully, on studying your color, on noting the subtle flutter of your eyelids, on a feel for the work built up through long years of direct experience, rather than relying on the precise electronic monitors that later decades will eventually bring into standard use. Too little of the anesthetic, and you might stir awake before you properly should. Too much, and the danger runs firmly in the other, far more serious direction. Holding a patient steady in that narrow, safe middle ground, hour after hour, purely through careful observation and practiced instinct, is a genuine art form. And the people who practice it here are considerably more skilled than the relatively primitive tools surrounding them might otherwise suggest. Coming back afterward is its own strange, disorienting journey. You surface slowly out of the blackness, dragged gradually upward through heavy layers of fog, your thoughts thick and your tongue thicker still. The room swims slowly into focus in disconnected pieces. Your throat feels scraped and raw. Your stomach feels uncertain, faintly rebellious. Your grip on the last several hours is completely, entirely gone. You're told, somewhere in the haze, that the operation went well, and you nod, or perhaps only think you nod, before sliding back under for a while and trying the whole process again a little later. The nausea and grogginess left behind by the ether can linger on for a long, genuinely miserable stretch afterward. A rough toll, paid willingly in exchange for the considerable mercy of feeling nothing at all during the main event itself. And it is a genuine mercy, make no mistake about that. A real wonder of this particular age. Not so very long ago, surgery meant being physically held down, and enduring every single terrible moment fully awake and fully conscious. And the arrival of reliable anesthesia transformed the operating room from a chamber of pure horror into a place of real, tangible hope that you can be sent painlessly away and returned safely in one piece is a genuine triumph worth feeling grateful for, even through the lingering fog, the sore throat, and the churning stomach that follow. It works far more often than it fails, which is precisely the sort of reassurance that, when you really sit with it, isn't actually all that reassuring at all. So you count backward. You slip quietly into the dark, and you trust the calm figure standing at your head to bring you safely back to the surface. When you do finally return, blinking and thoroughly groggy, you'll find that the truly hard part has really only just begun, because now comes the recovery, the long weeks that follow. So the operation is finally over, and now comes the truly punishing part, the recovery itself, measured here not in days, but in full weeks. Remember that great commandment of bed rest we discussed earlier. It arrives now with its full and considerable force. You will lie flat, immobile, tended to, and turned by others for a stretch of time that a modern patient would find genuinely unimaginable. Because the medicine of this era believes deeply, sincerely, that real healing requires total physical stillness. There is no encouraging voice urging you to get up and walk the halls the very next morning. No brisk physical therapist gently steering you toward the door. You wake from the surgery into a world that has shrunk down to the exact dimensions of your bed, and there it will remain for a very long while indeed. The instruction is simple and absolute. Do not move. Do not sit up without explicit permission. Do not so much as think about placing a single foot upon the floor. Your body has just been operated upon, and the wisdom of this age holds firmly that the kindest, safest possible thing you can do now is precisely nothing at all, for days that stretch on into weeks. So you settle in flat on your back and prepare to heal by the ancient, thoroughly revered method of lying still and simply waiting it out. The days blur together with alarming, almost hypnotic ease. Morning arrives, marked reliably by the trolley and the thermometer. The long middle stretch of the day yawns open, empty, and seemingly endless, filled only with the ceiling, the distant clock, and the low murmur of the ward around you. Evening comes with its supper tray and its little sleeping pill. And then another morning arrives, indistinguishable from the last one. You lose track entirely of which day of the week it actually is. You measure time instead in meals and rounds, and the slow, patient crawl of light across the far wall. Your entire world has become very small and very slow, and there is genuinely nothing left to do but endure it. The stillness itself becomes a kind of work, and a strangely exhausting one at that. You would think that doing absolutely nothing would prove restful, but the body actively rebels against enforced idleness of this kind. Your legs ache steadily to move. Your back registers a constant, low-grade protest. A restlessness builds quietly inside you with nowhere at all to go, trapped beneath the covers by doctor's orders and the full weight of this era's unwavering certainty. You count the ceiling tiles overhead until you know every single one of them by heart. You study the water stains and the light fixture with the focused intensity of a devoted scholar. Boredom becomes its own peculiar affliction here, one the ward simply has no pill prepared to treat. There is no cheerful physical therapist here to interrupt the monotony. No encouraging voice urging you gently onto your feet. No kind insistence that even a short walk down the hall might genuinely do you some good. That entire philosophy, the one that will eventually have patients up and moving within a single day of surgery, lies still far off in the future. Here, in this ward, movement itself is treated as the enemy of proper healing, and so you are kept carefully horizontal with the very best of intentions, praised regularly for your stillness, tended to faithfully in your bed, and left to mend at the slow, unhurried pace this particular era insists upon. The nurses do their genuine, patient best to make these endless days at least somewhat bearable. They turn you periodically. They adjust your pillows. They bring your meals on schedule and offer a kind word whenever they can spare one. But there is only so much any of them can realistically do against the sheer, grinding sameness of weeks spent lying flat on your back, watching the world quietly happen to other people from the fixed, unmoving vantage point of your own bed. Recovery in this era is not a brisk, energetic return to ordinary life. It is long, still, patient waiting, an act of genuine endurance measured out in ceiling tiles counted and clocks carefully watched. And here is the cruel twist, waiting patiently for anyone who holds still for too long. A real danger born directly from the very stillness meant to heal them. The war against bedsores. Here, then, is the cruel irony hiding at the very heart of all that heroic resting. Lie in one single position long enough, and your own body will eventually begin to protest in earnest. This ward, it turns out, is quietly waging a constant, exhausting war against the bedsore. Pressure builds steadily wherever skin meets mattress, at the heels, the hips, the shoulders, and without frequent, careful turning, the skin itself eventually gives way. The nurses do their genuine best here, rolling patients on a strict schedule, propping cushions carefully in place, rubbing gently at tender spots. But there are, quite simply, many beds in this ward, and comparatively few hands available to tend them all. The mechanics of the problem are simple and genuinely merciless. Your body was never actually designed to rest its full weight on the same few narrow points for hours and days at a stretch. Wherever bone presses skin firmly against the mattress, at the heels, at the base of the spine, at the hips, at the shoulder blades, the flow of blood gets squeezed down to a mere trickle, starved gradually of proper circulation. The skin in those particular spots grows first angry, then raw, then eventually breaks down entirely. Left unattended, What began as a faint red patch can deepen steadily into a genuine open wound. And a wound in a ward where infection already lurks quietly at the margins is very much the last thing anyone here actually wants to deal with. The nurses understand this particular danger intimately, and they wage a constant, tiring campaign against it every single day. On a fixed schedule, they come to turn you, easing you gently from your back onto one side, and later onto the other, carefully redistributing the pressure, so that no single spot bears the full burden for too long at a stretch. They tuck cushions and rolled cloth in beneath you to ease the load on the worst affected points. They rub gently at the tender places to coax the blood flow back, and they inspect your skin regularly with practiced, careful eyes, hunting patiently for the very first faint warning sign of trouble. It is diligent, entirely unglamorous work, and it genuinely never stops. But there are always more beds in this ward than there are available hands to tend them, and the campaign itself is fundamentally uphill. A single nurse may find herself responsible for an entire row of patients, each one needing turning, each one needing careful watching, each one competing quietly for the very same limited store of her time and attention. Do the simple arithmetic, and it becomes plain enough that no matter how devoted the staff genuinely are, someone, somewhere, may occasionally go a little too long between turns. Some tender patch of skin may go unwatched for just a moment too long. The whole system depends entirely on tireless human vigilance, and the people providing that vigilance are, after all, only human themselves, stretched thin across an unusually demanding ward. The deep irony here is genuinely impossible to miss, and it sits right at the very heart of this era's whole approach to patient care. The stillness prescribed specifically to heal you, the sacred bed rest praised by every doctor and enforced by every rule in the building, is the exact same thing quietly breeding this entirely new affliction. The cure and the harm walk hand in hand down the very same tidy ward, arm in arm, one quietly creating the conditions for the other to flourish. You're ordered to lie still in order to get well, and lying still simultaneously threatens to make you considerably worse. And everyone involved is doing precisely what this era genuinely believes to be right. For you personally, all of this means learning to genuinely welcome the discomfort of being turned. When the nurse arrives to shift your aching body onto a fresh side, you feel the brief, real relief of pressure lifting away from a spot that had begun, quietly, to burn. You shift position whenever you're permitted to, grateful for every small change, and you come slowly to understand a strange truth. This era is only just beginning to grasp for itself. Lying perfectly still, it turns out, is a great deal more difficult and a great deal more genuinely dangerous than it has ever sounded on paper. Staying whole through a long recovery is its own quiet, unglamorous battle. All of this brings us naturally to a question hanging quietly over the entire ward. One this era cares about enormously in certain ways, and strangely little in others. Let's talk about the subject of keeping things clean, the Cleanliness Paradox. Let's talk then about cleanliness, a subject the hospital cares about enormously in certain visible ways, and strangely, quietly little in others that matter just as much. The floors here are mopped to an actual shine. The bed linens are boiled repeatedly. Every surface gleams. And yet the simple, humble act of thoroughly washing one's hands between individual patients has not yet become the ironclad, unbreakable ritual it will eventually grow into. A doctor may move directly from one patient's bedside to the very next with the same unwashed hands and the very same brisk confidence. The reused needle continues making its familiar rounds. Germ theory itself is well understood, at least on paper, but it hasn't yet been fully burned into every single professional reflex. The visible cleanliness on display is genuinely impressive, and this ward takes real, considerable pride in it. Floors are scrubbed and polished until they shine like still water. Bed linens are boiled within an inch of their lives and folded into crisp, precise perfection. Surfaces are wiped down regularly. Bedpans are scoured thoroughly, and the entire place gleams with the confident sparkle of an institution that genuinely believes cleanliness sits right next to godliness. To your own eye, lying there in your bed, the ward looks entirely spotless, and that visible spotlessness is meant to reassure you. And to a real point, it genuinely does. But cleanliness, as it turns out, is not merely a matter of what can be seen with the naked eye. The invisible traffic of germs passing quietly from hand to patient and back to hand again is a considerably subtler enemy, and this particular era is still learning to fight it with the fierce, unbroken consistency that later decades will eventually demand as an absolute baseline. The doctor finishes his examination of the man in the next bed over, pauses briefly to think, and then moves directly onto you. The very same hands reaching out toward you, entirely unwashed in the gap between the two examinations. It isn't carelessness exactly, not by the standards of this particular day. It's simply that the habit of scrubbing thoroughly between every single patient hasn't yet hardened into truly unbreakable law. The equipment itself tells much the same story. The reused syringe continues traveling its familiar row of beds. The shared thermometer makes its own rounds. Instruments are cleaned, yes, boiled, and treated with genuine care. But the deep, obsessive, single-use caution of the future simply hasn't arrived yet. Germ theory itself is well understood by this point, taught in every medical school in the country, accepted by every practicing physician without exception. The gap here isn't really one of knowledge at all. The gap sits instead in the reflex, in the 1,000 tiny, automatic daily habits that eventually turn accumulated knowledge into genuinely consistent practice. And those particular habits are still, quietly, in the process of forming. So infection moves through this ward more freely than anyone here would honestly wish. drifting steadily through the gap between what everyone already knows and what everyone actually does in the rush and pressure of a genuinely busy working day. A wound that ought to heal cleanly may occasionally sour instead. A patient admitted for one particular trouble may quietly pick up an entirely different one from the very bed meant to cure the first. It happens quietly, without anyone involved doing anything they personally consider wrong, inside a building that genuinely believes itself to be clean, and by its own visible standards, very much is. The shine on the floor and the actual safety of the patient underneath it are not always, quite unfortunately, the very same thing. The nurses and doctors working here are not villains in any of this, and it's genuinely worth saying that plainly. They work extraordinarily hard. They clean diligently and often. They follow the very best practices their era has managed to settle upon, and in the doing, they save a great many lives along the way. The real failing here belongs to the era itself, not to the individual people working within it. A matter of collective understanding that simply hasn't yet fully caught up with itself. In the years ahead, thorough hand-washing between every single patient will become something close to a sacred rite. The reused needle will vanish entirely into history, and infection rates across the board will fall accordingly. But that particular reckoning still lies somewhere ahead. For now, you lie quietly in your gleaming ward, surrounded by visible shine, and served faithfully by devoted hands, trusting in a cleanliness that is entirely real to the eye, and rather more imperfect underneath it. The blood in the bag. If you happen to need blood during your stay, the good news is that transfusion, by this point in history, has genuinely become a real and life-saving science. Blood, types carefully matched, properly stored, and kept ready at a moment's notice. The less good news is that this era simply doesn't yet possess the tools required to screen that donated blood for everything it might be quietly carrying inside it. Certain infections, hepatitis chief among them, can ride along inside the bag entirely unnoticed, with no reliable test currently standing guard against them. So the transfusion that saves your life today may, in a genuine but invisible sense, hand you a quiet problem for later on, a trade that nobody standing in the room even realizes they're currently making. Consider first, though, just how far this particular field has already come, because it truly is a marvel in its own right. The great puzzle of blood itself, the very reason so many earlier attempts at transfusion ended in outright disaster, has, by this point, been thoroughly solved. Doctors now understand clearly that blood comes in distinct types, that giving the wrong type to the wrong patient is genuinely deadly, and that the right careful match can be an actual gift of life restored. Blood can now be collected, properly stored, and kept ready, drawn from generous donors, and held carefully in reserve against the moment some patient desperately needs it. When your own body has lost too much, whether to surgery, to accident, or to illness, a bag of properly matched blood can be run steadily into your veins and pull you back decisively from the edge. It stands as one of the quiet triumphs of modern medicine. You watch it happen from your own bed. The dark red bag hangs suspended above you. The thin line snakes its way down toward your arm. The slow, steady drip carries a complete stranger's blood into your own body. There is something almost solemn in the sight of it, this borrowed life quietly flowing into you. And you feel, in the moment, only genuine gratitude, because gratitude is simply the natural response to being saved from the brink. The nurse checks the flow rate periodically, notes it carefully on your chart, and moves on to her next task. And you lie there letting the transfusion get on with its careful, restorative work. But here is the shadow that nobody currently in the room is able to see, because the tools required to see it simply don't exist yet. That donated blood, matched so carefully by type, cannot yet be fully screened for the smaller, quieter dangers it might also be carrying. Certain infections can hide within it, silent and entirely invisible, and hepatitis in particular can ride along completely undetected, passed along from a donor who never knew they carried it, to a patient who never thought to fear it in the first place. There is, quite simply, no reliable test standing at the door to catch it. No way to hold the bag up to the light and know with any certainty that it's entirely safe. And so a quiet, unspoken trade gets made without anyone's explicit knowledge or consent. The transfusion that saves your life today may, in a small fraction of cases, leave behind a problem that only surfaces much later on. A slow, invisible passenger that arrived tucked inside the very gift that rescued you. Nobody in this scenario chose this outcome deliberately. The donor gave in complete good faith. The doctors acted purely to save your life. The bargain itself was struck without anyone at the bedside. Even realizing a bargain was quietly being made, because the knowledge and the tools required to reveal it are still years away from actually arriving on the scene. It stands as another one of this era's honest, understandable limits, the kind that later medicine will eventually close with far better testing and far greater caution, screening every single unit of donated blood so thoroughly that these hidden passengers can no longer slip quietly through. That future is coming. It simply hasn't arrived yet in this particular ward, on this particular day, above this particular bed. For now, the transfusion remains a genuine rescue, offered up in good faith with the very best that this age can currently provide. And you receive it with a full, grateful heart, watching the dark red drip fall steadily, trusting as always in hands doing their honest, sincere best. From the general wards, let's now move to a place where entirely new life comes into the world, though not, perhaps, in quite the gentle way you might currently be imagining. Let's step carefully into the maternity ward. The maternity ward. Let's step now into the maternity ward, where the simple act of bringing new life into the world has been carefully transformed into a strangely lonely, heavily managed medical ordeal. In this era, a laboring mother is frequently given a particular combination of drugs meant specifically to erase her own memory of the pain involved. A practice widely known as twilight sleep, which leaves her groggy, thoroughly disoriented, and occasionally restrained for her own physical safety, in a manner that reads as deeply distressing by any later standard. The father, meanwhile, is not welcome anywhere near the room itself. He's banished instead to a separate waiting area to pace anxiously and worry, kept entirely apart from the actual birth of his own child. The intention behind all of this genuinely began as a kind of sincere mercy. Childbirth had always represented an ordeal of real pain and real fear, and the medicine of this era sincerely wished to spare women the very worst of it. Twilight sleep was offered up specifically as that relief, a careful combination of drugs that dulled the immediate experience and, crucially, wiped away the memory of it entirely afterward, so that a mother might eventually wake beside her newborn child and recall almost nothing of the genuine difficulty that came before. On paper, it genuinely sounded like a real gift, the deliberate removal of suffering from one of life's hardest and most demanding passages. And a great many women specifically requested it themselves, hoping sincerely to be spared. The actual reality inside the delivery room proved considerably harder and stranger than the promise had suggested. The drugs involved didn't truly end the pain itself so much as simply remove the memory of it afterward, which meant a laboring woman might genuinely continue to suffer while entirely unable to remember or fully control herself in the moment, drifting through a disoriented haze, frightened and confused. In that particular confused state, some women thrashed about or struggled physically. And so, in a detail that later generations would find deeply troubling indeed, they were sometimes restrained outright for their own protection, laboring entirely alone in a fog they could neither properly understand nor later recall. It amounted to isolation of the most profound kind imaginable, physically present for the birth of one's own child, and yet, in every meaningful sense, entirely absent from the experience of it. The father, meanwhile, had no place whatsoever in that particular room. He was sent off to wait elsewhere, to pace some corridor or waiting area, cut off completely from the birth of his own child, permitted to finally meet the baby only once everything had concluded and everyone had been made properly tidy again. The warm, familiar image we now hold of a partner sitting bedside, holding a hand and sharing directly in the moment, simply didn't exist within this particular institution. Birth here was treated as a medical procedure managed entirely by staff, and the family waited quietly outside its closed doors. Afterward came the same long, forced stillness that ruled the rest of the hospital, now applied to new mothers who were kept flat and recovering for many days at a stretch, when they might have genuinely preferred to rise and hold and properly tend to their own newborn infants. The baby, meanwhile, was often kept apart entirely in the hospital nursery, brought to the mother only on a fixed schedule, the two of them separated by the ward's own institutional routines. It was, in its own way, genuine care, and it was sincerely meant kindly, but it held mother and child at a careful institutional distance during precisely the hours when real closeness matters most. For countless women, this was simply the shape that one of the most significant days of their entire lives happened to take, and many of them carried the disorientation and quiet loneliness of the experience with them for years afterward, largely in silence. This isn't a subject for lightness or easy jokes. These were mothers who wanted, quite simply, to bring their children safely into the world, served by a system that sincerely believed it was helping them, and that, in many genuine ways, failed to see clearly exactly what it was quietly taking away from them in the process. The gentler, more humane approach to childbirth, with partners present in the room and mothers awake, and genuinely in control of their own experience, lay in a future still being actively fought for by reformers of the era. And once the child had finally arrived safely, the smallest and most fragile among these newborns faced dangers that the hospital staff, in their genuine devotion, never once intended to create. The nursery. Down the hall from the maternity ward lies the nursery itself, rows of newborns resting quietly behind a wide pane of glass. And here the tone must genuinely soften, because this is precisely where good intentions led somewhere quite heartbreaking. Premature infants, the smallest and most fragile patients anywhere in the entire building, are placed carefully into incubators and given extra oxygen specifically to help them breathe properly and ultimately survive. For a good while, the attending doctors sincerely believe they are doing everything correctly. Only later does the wider medical world come to understand that too much oxygen, delivered this way, was quietly damaging the developing eyes of some of these tiny bobbies, leaving an entire generation of children with lasting, permanent harm to their eyesight. Picture the nursery itself for a moment, a warm and genuinely hopeful place, at least on its surface. Rows of tiny newborns resting behind a wide pane of glass, tended around the clock by nurses who have devoted themselves entirely to the careful nurturing of the very smallest and most vulnerable patients. For infants born too soon, too early, and too physically frail to properly manage the world entirely on their own. The incubator represents a genuine lifeline, a warm, fully enclosed cradle that shelters them carefully and helps support their breathing while their own tiny bodies work desperately to catch up. Into these incubators, the nursing staff introduced additional oxygen, reasoning sensibly enough at the time that a struggling infant needed every possible bit of help drawing breath that could reasonably be given. For a good stretch of time, it genuinely seemed to be working exactly as intended, and the doctors involved had every reason in the world to believe they had found a genuine way to save bobbies who might otherwise, tragically, have been lost entirely. More of these fragile infants survived their first difficult weeks. The oxygen appeared to be doing precisely what everyone had hoped it would do, supporting the smallest patients safely through their most dangerous early days. And the practice spread rapidly on the strength of that very real hope. There was, in the moment, no particular reason for anyone to suspect that the very thing sustaining these children might simultaneously be quietly harming them in a way nobody involved could actually see. The harm itself only revealed its true shape slowly, and it amounted to a genuine, quiet tragedy. In time, it eventually became clear that the generous levels of oxygen being administered, the very intervention specifically meant to save these fragile bobbies, were, in fact, injuring their still developing eyes, and that a meaningful number of the children who did survive their difficult early days went on to suffer permanent, lasting damage to their sight as a direct result. An entire generation of infants was affected before the underlying connection was properly understood, and the practice itself was eventually corrected. It stands as one of the hardest lessons medicine has ever had to learn, the painful discovery that a treatment given in genuine love and sincere hope had carried, all along, a devastating and entirely invisible cost. What matters most in remembering this properly is that absolutely no one involved meant for any of this to happen. The doctors and nurses who cared for these particular infants fought fiercely for their tiny lives with everything they had, sitting up through countless long nights, willing the smallest and weakest among them to grow steadily stronger, acting throughout on the very best medical understanding available to them at the time. And that understanding, tragically, was simply and genuinely incomplete. The failing here was never one of cruelty or neglect on anyone's part. It was, instead, the failing of a medical science still actively learning, doing its sincere best in every way, and only much later coming to fully see and understand the real price of what it had unknowingly done. It stands, even now, as one of the most solemn reminders this particular era of hospital medicine has to offer us, that even care given with the very deepest devotion, by hands that genuinely love their patients fiercely, can still carry within it a harm that nobody yet knows how to properly recognize. Medicine learned some of its very hardest lessons here, tragically, far too late, and always at a real cost borne directly by the very people it was sincerely trying its best to help. The children affected by this, and the families who loved them dearly, deserve to be remembered here with honesty and with genuine tenderness, never as a passing footnote, and never with anything less than real care and respect. The polio ward. Now we come to the polio ward, and the mood across this entire floor shifts noticeably the moment you step through its doors. This is, after all, the 1950s, and polio remains the genuine terror stalking every American summer, striking children down without any real warning at all. This particular ward is home to one of the most haunting machines in the entire history of medicine, the iron lung. It's a long metal cylinder that fully encloses a patient up to the neck, breathing steadily for them with a rhythmic, mechanical push and pull. Whenever their own chest muscles simply no longer can manage the task alone. To properly understand the weight carried by this ward, you first have to understand the fear that fills this entire era well beyond its walls. Polio arrives reliably with the warm weather each year, and every single summer, parents across the country watch their children with a dread that genuinely never fully lifts. It strikes without warning and without any real mercy, and it seems cruelly to fall hardest upon the very young. A child perfectly healthy and running around 1 week may be gravely, seriously ill the very next. And there is, at this point, no real cure to offer anyone, no reliable way to stop the disease's progress once it takes hold. Only the desperate, quiet hope that it will pass through lightly, set against the constant fear that it simply will not. Swimming pools sit empty through the hottest months. Public gatherings are avoided out of quiet caution. An entire society, in effect, holds its collective breath through every summer. For the particular children, this disease strikes hardest, the ones whose own breathing muscles fail them entirely. The iron lung becomes the very last line standing between life and death. It's a long, fully sealed cylinder built from metal, and a patient lies within it with only their head emerging from one end, the rest of their body fully enclosed inside. The machine works by changing the air pressure around the chest in a slow, steady rhythm, drawing air into lungs that can no longer manage to draw it in on their own, and pushing it back out again, breathing tirelessly for the patient hour after hour, day after day, without pause. Its rhythmic mechanical sigh fills the entire ward, a sound that genuinely never stops. The sound, quite literally, of machines breathing for children. Inside the cylinder itself, a child sees the world only through a small angled mirror mounted carefully above their head, catching a reflected glimpse of the ward around them, the ceiling overhead, the faces that lean in close to speak with them. Weeks may pass this way, sometimes considerably longer than anyone standing nearby wishes to imagine, to lie fully enclosed and completely still, breathing entirely to the rhythm of a machine, watching the whole of life pass by in a small tilted mirror, asks for a kind of courage that sits almost beyond ordinary words. And the children in this ward summon exactly that courage, day after day, with a quiet bravery that would genuinely humble anyone who happened to witness it firsthand. The nurses and doctors who work in this particular ward carry their own quiet form of heroism as well. They tend to these children with truly endless patience, speaking gently into the little mirrors, adjusting the great humming machines, offering comfort and simple company through the long, enclosed hours. They cannot cure what has already happened to these children, and they know this perfectly well. And still, they give everything they personally have toward easing it, toward keeping hope genuinely alive in a ward where hope, by any measure, is quite hard-won. There is a real tenderness present in this place that sits quietly alongside the fear. A fierce, unwavering devotion to children caught up in something that no child, by any reasonable measure, should ever have to face. And hanging over all of it is a single suspended hope. The hope of a vaccine, whispered about quietly, worked toward tirelessly, prayed for earnestly, the knowledge that somewhere out there, researchers are racing against time to find a genuine way to stop this disease before it can strike again, represents the one small light glowing at the very edge of this darkened ward. That light, as it happens, is closer than anyone currently in this room quite dares to believe. A coming triumph that will one day empty rooms exactly like this one forever. But on this particular day, in this particular ward, it has not yet arrived. And so the machines simply breathe on, and the children endure, and the nurses keep their patient watch through the night. From the polio ward, let's move now to another place, entirely defined by the long, slow passage of time. A wing where genuine recovery is measured not in mere days or weeks, but in full seasons. The tuberculosis ward. Let's visit now the wing set specifically aside for tuberculosis patients, where treatment itself is measured not in days or even weeks, but in entire seasons. In this era, before the newest generation of drugs has fully taken hold, the standard answer to this old and stubborn disease is often simply rest, fresh air, good nourishing food, and time. An absolutely enormous amount of time. Patients may remain here for months on end, sometimes for well over a year, wheeled regularly out onto open porches to breathe the cold outdoor air that the medicine of this particular day sincerely believes will help their damaged lungs slowly mend. Tuberculosis is an old and remarkably patient enemy, a disease of the lungs that wastes the body away slowly and stubbornly resists any of medicine's usual quick fixes. For generations before this one, the only genuine treatment anyone could realistically offer was simply to give the body every possible advantage available, and then wait patiently. And so that is precisely what this era does. The patient is prescribed deep, prolonged rest, along with nourishing food meant to help rebuild physical strength, and above all, fresh air, great quantities of it, based on the sincere belief that clean, cold air itself functions as a genuine kind of medicine for ailing lungs. It amounts to treatment by patience, healing by sheer endurance. The rhythm of this particular wing is genuinely unlike anywhere else in the entire hospital. Beds may be wheeled directly out onto open porches and balconies so that patients can lie for hours at a stretch in the open air, wrapped carefully against the chill, breathing deeply of the cold that is sincerely thought to help them mend over time. There they rest and rest, and rest some more through the morning, through the afternoon, through the changing weather outside, through days that fold gradually into weeks, and weeks that fold slowly into entire months. Time itself moves differently here, slowed carefully down to match the pace of the disease itself, unhurried and genuinely vast. To be a patient in this particular ward is to press pause on your own life for an extraordinary stretch of it. Months may pass this way, and for some patients, well over a year, spent entirely away from home, from work, from family, living quietly among others, walking that same slow road alongside you. Genuine friendships form in this strange, suspended world, bonds between people who share the long waiting together, who mark the changing seasons together from their shared beds and porches. It amounts to a strange and quiet existence altogether. A long, enforced stillness carved directly out of the very middle of a person's remaining years, asking for a patience that is nearly unimaginable to a world otherwise accustomed to considerably quicker cures. And yet, even here, real change is beginning to stir. New medicines are just beginning to arrive on the scene, drugs capable of actually fighting the underlying disease itself, rather than merely supporting the body while it struggles alone against it. And they carry with them the genuine promise of shrinking these endless days into something far shorter and considerably kinder. The long era of rest cures and open porches is beginning, slowly, to draw toward its eventual close, though it has certainly not fully done so quite yet. For the patients currently residing in this particular wing, on this particular day, the old ways still firmly rule, and the treatment remains, above all else, simply time itself. So they wait, these patients, with a quiet endurance that asks genuinely everything of them. They rest out on their porches in the cold, clean air. They eat their nourishing meals dutifully. They mark the slow turning of the seasons around them, and they hold tightly to the hope of one day going home again, whole and healthy. It amounts to a form of courage that makes essentially no noise at all. The quiet courage of simply enduring, day after long day, trusting that patience, fresh air, and time will eventually accomplish what nothing faster yet can. There is a deep and genuine dignity present in that long, quiet waiting. The psychiatric ward. There is a section of this hospital, or in many cases, an entirely separate institution altogether, that we must approach with particular care, and that is the world of psychiatric treatment as it existed in this era. Here, the medical understanding of the human mind remains genuinely young, and the available tools remain blunt, sometimes tragically so. Overcrowded wards, harsh living conditions, and treatments applied with far more confidence than actual underlying knowledge define a system that too often failed the very vulnerable people placed in its charge. Some procedures performed during this era, carried out in the sincere belief that they genuinely helped, caused permanent and irreversible harm to the people who underwent them. The understanding of the human mind in this era is, by later standards, painfully incomplete. complex conditions that affect a person's thoughts, moods, and behavior are only dimly understood at this point. Their underlying causes still largely mysterious, their available treatments crude and frequently mistaken, and yet the confidence of this era remained remarkably high regardless, and treatments were applied to genuinely vulnerable people with a certainty that the actual knowledge behind them simply could not support. It was, in truth, a field of medicine reaching considerably beyond its own real understanding, and the people who ultimately paid the price for that overreach were those least able to protect themselves. The living conditions in which many of these patients found themselves were frequently harsh. Wards and institutions were often overcrowded, understaffed, and grim places where people could be confined for extended stretches with very little say in their own lives and very little realistic prospect of leaving. The basic dignity every person deserves was, too often, simply absent, lost somewhere in the sheer strain of overburdened facilities, and an era that did not yet know how to properly care for those placed in its charge. People who genuinely needed compassion and understanding sometimes found only confinement instead. Some of the treatments carried out during this era represent, honestly, the hardest part of this history to face directly. Procedures were performed in the sincere and genuine belief that they would help patients. Procedures that we now understand caused profound and permanent harm, altering people irreversibly, stripping away parts of who they fundamentally were. These procedures were carried out by practitioners who genuinely believed, in good faith, that they were doing good work, which makes the eventual outcome no less tragic to look back on. Countless patients underwent these interventions with very little meaningful say in the matter, and lived with the lasting consequences for the remainder of their lives. This is not a subject for lightness, and there will be none offered here. The people who passed through these wards were human beings, every one of them deserving of genuine care and dignity. And too often they received neither, not through any single deliberate act of cruelty, but through the accumulated failures of an entire system that did not yet understand what it was actually doing. They were sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, people carrying inner lives every bit as real and precious as anyone else's. And the harm done to them was genuinely real and genuinely lasting. Their suffering deserves to be remembered plainly and honestly, without exaggeration and without dismissal. It stands as a chapter of medical history that later reformers would look back upon with real, genuine sorrow, and one that would eventually drive enormous, necessary change as public understanding grew, and as society itself came to insist upon compassion, informed consent, and basic dignity in the care of the human mind. That change was hard-won and long overdue, built entirely upon the recognition of everything that had gone wrong before it. But in this era, much of that change still lay ahead in the future, and the people occupying these wards waited, in the meantime, in in a world that simply had not yet learned how to properly help them. Remembering them honestly is, at minimum, the very least that we owe them. Closely tied to this particular ward was a specific treatment that, in this era, was too often delivered without the safeguards that would later make it considerably safer and more humane. Electroconvulsive therapy, closely connected to that same ward, is a treatment that, in this era, was frequently delivered without the safeguards we would now consider absolutely essential. Electroconvulsive therapy, the deliberate use of an electrical current to alter brain activity, existed already in the 1950s, but often without the anesthesia and muscle relaxants that would later make the procedure far safer and considerably more humane. For patients of this particular time, the experience could prove frightening and physically painful. Applied broadly across many conditions, and in some cases, without meaningful patient consent at all. The treatment itself involves passing a controlled electrical current through the brain in order to deliberately produce a seizure, based on a belief that held some genuine scientific truth, namely, that this process could meaningfully relieve certain severe conditions of the mind. In careful, modern hands, with the proper protections firmly in place, this treatment would one day become a legitimate and genuinely valuable medical tool, capable of helping people through real and serious psychiatric distress when other available treatments had already failed them. The core underlying idea was never entirely without merit. The real problem in this particular era lay squarely in how the treatment was actually carried out. In the 1950s, this treatment was frequently delivered without the safeguards that would later become absolutely essential to its safe practice. The anesthesia that would eventually allow a patient to sleep peacefully through the entire procedure was often simply absent. The muscle relaxants that would later prevent the violent physical convulsions associated with the seizure were often not used at all. This meant that patients could experience the full treatment while fully awake and physically unprotected, an ordeal that proved both genuinely frightening and physically punishing in ways that later, considerably safer versions of the same procedure would entirely avoid. What could have been endured gently was instead, all too often, endured harshly. The treatment was also applied far more broadly than careful medical practice would ever allow, administered to many patients across many different conditions, with a level of confidence that significantly outran the actual medical understanding behind it. And it was, distressingly often, administered without the meaningful, informed consent of the very people receiving it, patients who frequently had little real power to question or to refuse what was actively being done to their own bodies. Vulnerable people, already confined and already struggling, underwent a genuinely difficult and frightening treatment with very little say in the matter. And that absence of real choice compounds the hardship of the experience considerably. The gentler, more precise version of this same treatment, the one properly hedged about with anesthesia, informed consent, and careful medical limits, lay still in the future, and it would go on to represent an enormous improvement, transforming what had been a crude and frightening ordeal into a controlled, humane medical procedure. That future eventually did arrive, built directly upon the hard recognition of everything that had gone wrong with how the treatment had previously been used. But it had simply not yet arrived in this particular era, and what existed in its place was considerably cruder, far more sweeping in its application, and far harder for patients to bear. The people who underwent this treatment during this period deserve to be remembered honestly, not merely as clinical cases or historical footnotes, but as human beings who endured something genuinely painful and frightening, with very little power to shape their own care. Their experience forms part of the true, complete history of this hospital, and it should be neither softened for comfort nor treated with anything other than the honesty and respect it is properly owed. Medicine would go on to learn a great deal from what happened to these patients, and it would eventually do considerably better because of those hard lessons. But that learning came at a real cost that they, personally, were the ones who paid. Before we leave these particular wards behind, there remains one more difficult truth about the hospital of this era that must be spoken plainly and without flinching. A truth about exactly who was allowed access to care in the first place, who was allowed care. Let's face this directly, plainly, and without flinching. As your own long week inside this building draws quietly toward its close, in much of the country during the 1950s, hospitals themselves were segregated by race, and the color of a person's skin could determine, quite literally, which building they were permitted to enter, which ward they were allowed to lie in, whether a bed was even available to them at all, and in some tragic cases, whether they were turned away entirely during a genuine medical emergency, forced instead to travel considerably farther in search of help. This was never a small footnote tucked away at the edges of an era, otherwise defined by gleaming tile and starched caps. It was a profound and entirely deliberate injustice, built directly into the foundations of American medicine. The reality here was stark, and it was enforced through both law and custom alike. In much of the country, and most rigidly across the American South, hospitals were divided strictly along racial lines as a matter of formal statute and deeply entrenched social practice. Black patients, along with other people of color, were routinely directed toward separate wards, separate wings, or in many cases, entirely separate buildings altogether. And the facilities set aside for them were almost without exception inferior in every meaningful sense, underfunded, overcrowded, and consistently short of the resources that flowed considerably more freely elsewhere in the very same institution, where a white patient found an available bed waiting for them. A black patient in the very same building might instead find only a crowded corridor, a long wait, or a locked door that that simply would not open at all. The consequences of this system could be, quite literally, a matter of life and death. A person of color arriving in the midst of a genuine emergency might be turned away entirely from the nearest available hospital and forced, instead, to travel a considerably greater distance in search of one that would actually accept them, losing precious, irreplaceable time that the sick and the seriously injured could scarcely afford to lose under any circumstances. Care that should, by any reasonable measure, have been offered freely to anyone in genuine need was instead carefully rationed by race, and people suffered, and in a great many documented cases, died outright for want of treatment that was physically close at hand, yet remained entirely out of reach for them specifically. The injustice at work here was never abstract in any sense. It was measured out concretely, in real bodies, and in real, irreplaceable hours. This same injustice extended, just as forcefully, to those who wished to heal others as a profession. Black doctors and black nurses, skilled, thoroughly dedicated, and fully qualified in every professional sense, were frequently barred entirely from the very institutions where their considerable talents were most urgently needed, denied outright the chance to practice within hospitals reserved exclusively for white staff and white patients, a profession that should, by rights, have welcomed every single capable and qualified pair of hands, instead turned a great many of them away purely on the basis of race, depriving entire communities of desperately needed care and denying gifted, hardworking people the very work they had spent their whole lives training carefully to do. The resulting loss fell upon everyone touched by this system, though it fell, quite obviously, nowhere near equally. None of this was accidental in any sense, and none of it was merely incidental to an otherwise well-meaning era. It was, instead, a deliberate system, upheld methodically by law, by long-standing custom, and by the conscious, repeated choices of institutions and the individual people who ran them. And it stood in direct, glaring contradiction to absolutely everything a hospital is meant, at its core, to represent: a place ostensibly devoted entirely to healing turned away the sick and the suffering on the basis of their skin, and did so quite openly, as a matter of formal, stated policy. That stark contradiction sits at the very heart of any genuinely honest account of American medicine during this era, and it simply cannot be smoothed over, minimized, or quietly set aside in the retelling. The long, difficult struggle to end this system, to tear down the walls of segregation in hospitals and in every other corner of American life, was already gathering considerable force during these very years, and it would, in time, go on to achieve enormous, hard-won change across the country. But that particular change was still very much being fought for, at genuine and considerable cost, by people of extraordinary courage and conviction. In the era of this particular ward, on this particular day, the injustice remained plain, deliberate, and deeply, unmistakably wrong. Any picture of the gleaming 1950s American hospital that quietly leaves this piece out is, quite simply, not an honest or complete picture at all. And so, it is set down here plainly, without softening, and you carry that knowledge forward with you as your own long week inside these walls finally draws to its close. Discharge. And so, somehow, against all odds, you have survived your entire week. And now comes the final trial standing between you and home, leaving. The doctor decides, on a morning entirely of his own choosing, that you are now permitted to stand, to dress yourself properly, and to rejoin the world of the living outside these walls. And there is a genuine, giddy relief in finally trading that thin paper gown for your own familiar clothes. But waiting for you at the front desk is the bill. And while it may look almost quaint by later financial standards, in this particular era, it lands with real, considerable weight on a great many families, because widespread health insurance is still very much finding its footing across the country, and a serious illness can quietly drain an entire household's careful savings in the space of a single week. The morning of your release arrives without much advance warning, announced by the doctor during his regular rounds, with the exact same quiet authority he brings to absolutely everything else. You are, he declares simply, well enough now to go home. And just like that, the sentence you've been serving is lifted. The relief of it is almost dizzying to experience. You're helped carefully out of the bed you have come to know entirely too well over these past several days, and you peel off, for the final time, the thin paper gown that has served as your uniform of surrender all week long. You dress once more in your own real clothes, the familiar fabric feeling strange and genuinely wonderful against skin that has known only hospital cotton for 7 long days running. You discover, somewhat to your surprise, that you are considerably weaker than you had expected to be. All those long days of enforced stillness have left your legs unsteady beneath you, and your overall strength noticeably diminished. And the simple, ordinary act of standing up and getting dressed takes considerably more out of you than it reasonably should, but you manage it regardless, buttoning your own shirt with your own 2 hands, a small, quiet reclaiming of the independence you checked at the door a full week earlier. You gather up your few remaining belongings, say your genuine goodbyes to the neighbors occupying the beds around you, the total strangers who became, over the course of one strange week, a strange sort of temporary family, and you prepare to walk back out into the wider world beyond these doors. And then, at the front desk, comes a reckoning of an entirely different kind. The bill is presented to you, a careful, itemized account of your full week of medical care. And while the actual sums involved may look relatively modest to a later eye, in this particular era, they can land with genuine financial weight. Widespread health insurance remains, at this point in American history, a young and rather uneven thing, nowhere near the safety net it will eventually become for later generations. And for a great many families, a serious illness of this kind means paying entirely out of their own pocket for every single day, every treatment, every night spent in that narrow iron bed. A hospital stay of this length can quietly drain a household's careful, hard-earned savings, turning what began as a medical crisis into a financial one that lingers on long after the patient themselves has fully healed. You settle what you reasonably can at the desk, sign one final form to join the small mountain of paperwork your week here has generated, and receive whatever parting instructions the staff see fit to send you home with. Then you turn toward the front doors, toward the daylight waiting patiently beyond them, and you walk slowly and rather unsteadily out of the hospital and back into your own waiting life. The fresh outdoor air hits you like an unexpected gift. The ordinary sounds of the street outside, the open sky overhead, entirely unframed by any window for the first time in a week. All of it feels impossibly rich and vivid after 7 straight days of ceiling and ward. Behind you, the hospital hums quietly on, exactly as it did before you first arrived, and exactly as it will continue doing long after you've gone. Somewhere inside, a thermometer is being carefully shaken down and passed along to the next patient in line. Somewhere, a needle is being boiled for its next round of use. Somewhere, a meal trolley is rattling steadily toward a ward full of people currently learning, exactly as you did, what it genuinely means to hand your own body over entirely to the care of this remarkable, well-meaning, and deeply imperfect place. You step away from it thinner, paler, considerably poorer in the wallet, and profoundly grateful simply to be upright and walking under your own power once again. One more soul who walked in clutching a clipboard and walked back out, having successfully survived the week. A quiet reflection, and as you make your way home, back toward your own bed and your own ordinary life, it's worth pausing for a moment to genuinely reflect on everything you witnessed inside those gleaming hospital walls, and on the real people who lived through all of it, not for a single dramatized week, but for real, for the whole of their working lives. So there you have it. A full week survived inside the gleaming, humming, thoroughly well-meaning world of the American hospital in the 1950s. You endured the paper gown and the beige, colorless broth, the reused needle and the 3 a.m. thermometer check, the doctor who spoke about you rather than directly to you, and the bed rest so sacred and so revered that it very nearly did you serious harm in the process. You lay flat while the ceiling above you slowly became the entirety of your known universe. You breathed air thick with tobacco smoke, and you placed your whole fragile existence in the trust of an invisible beam and a masked stranger standing over an operating table. It was, by any modern measure, deeply uncomfortable. It was frequently undignified. And looking back now from the comfort of your own soft, modern bed, more than a little absurd in places. But it was also, quite genuinely, so much more than that. Behind the starched caps and the polished floors were real living people, patients and nurses and doctors alike, doing the very best they possibly could with the knowledge and the tools their particular moment in history had actually given them. There were children breathing steadily to the rhythm of a machine. Mothers laboring entirely alone. And countless souls who suffered quietly in an era that was still, in every real sense, learning how to properly care for them. Some of them were turned away for reasons that should never, under any circumstances, have mattered at all. They deserve, every one of them, to be remembered, not as footnotes tucked into the margins of history, but as people who lived full, complicated lives of their own. And so tonight, as you settle into clean sheets, in a world of gentler hands, more honest answers, and a medical science that has learned so very many hard lessons in the decades since, perhaps take just a moment to whisper a quiet, genuine thank you to everyone who came before you. The ones who endured the iron bed, the paper gown, and everything that came along with them, so that the rest of us might one day inherit something considerably better.